Hey, everybody. Glad that you are here with us tonight. We're going to have yet another great late night chat. Buckle up and hold on tight. Here we go.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. So glad that you're here with us tonight. We're going to have yet another great late night chat. We're going to follow our usual format, which is I give my opening remarks. Then after that, we do the roll call. Then after that, I answer your questions for the remainder of the night. So if there's something you would like me to talk about in the second half of our show, all you need to do is send me a Rumble rant on the Rumble. Send me a Cash App, Caleb Moppa 22. But the best way to help me out is to buy me a coffee. Buy me a coffee. Caleb Moppin on Buy Me a Coffee. All of those ways are ways that you can ask questions. It is your questions that make the second half of the show spectacular and awesome. So by all means, send me some questions for the second half of the show. We're following our usual format tonight. I will, a couple announcements. Join the Center for Political Innovation. We are on fire. We got all kinds of great activities coming up. We just had, a couple meetings over the weekend, and all kinds of great stuff is in the works. Great activities coming up. We got the UN General Assembly, and I'll get into that a little bit later, and all kinds of things are happening. If you want to be part of an anti-imperialist group, go to cpiusa.org and become a dues-paying member. You should be getting emails after that invite you to the Saturday membership calls. We can connect you with people in your area. It's a great way to meet people. I will also mention that our latest CPI book, which is called Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, is breaking records. It is, at this point, it is the top new release on Amazon in the category of radical political thought. We're doing great. I mean, this is absolutely spectacular. This book is breaking records. I did an interview with Kim Iverson about it. I talked to Jamarl Thomas about it. Looks like I've got some other great interviews about the book scheduled. Very, very exciting. So, check out the book. And other than that, we are going to follow our usual format. First, my opening remarks, followed by the roll call, and then I answer your questions for the remainder of the show. So send me questions, Rumble rants, Caleb Moppin 22 on Cash App, or buy me a coffee to get your questions answered. So tonight, the opening remarks, couple things. One news item that is worth pointing out is that on Friday, there was a vote taken of the United Nations General Assembly that has gotten virtually no attention. I've seen it reported several different places, but it's gotten virtually no attention. And that makes me wonder what's going on here. And I feel like there is going to be a final decision about this, and we'll know for sure. But on Friday, the United Nations General Assembly, which is the body that includes every member country, well over 200 countries, voted to not hold this year's UN General Assembly in New York, but instead to hold it in Geneva. Why? Because the United States has refused to grant visas to the Palestinian delegation. Mahmoud Abbas, who's the leader of the Palestinian Authority, wants to speak before the UN General Assembly. The Palestinian Authority is recognized as a member state by the United Nations. And so the idea is that Mahmoud Abbas should be able to come in and speak at the UN General Assembly, but the United States is not going to approve his visa. So it looks like the UN General Assembly voted to not have the UNGA in New York. However, at the same time, I'm not seeing that everywhere. And there was a vote that happened on Friday, but I feel like it's not final yet. We will know ultimately what's going to happen. If this ends up being the case, that'll be big. And it's not the first time it's happened. They did it once before for the same reason. The United States would not give the Palestinian representative a visa, and so they moved the UNGA to Geneva. So we'll see what happens with this. There is a UN headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, and it may be that they end up having the UNGA there this year. It's not, it's not confirmed. It is not confirmed. So we shall see. We shall see. But yeah, it's certainly interesting. And there's a lot going on with regards to Israel and Venezuela. The USA is threatening Venezuela. And I just want to go over, there's just a number of things there. First of all, the aid flotilla that is headed to Gaza has been bombed by Israeli drones. Now, the people in Gaza are starving. A group of humanitarian activists, including people we're not really big fans of, like Greta Thunberg and others, have decided they're going to go to Gaza and deliver aid. Israel has bombed the aid ships. Now, they've done this before, not the first time they've done it. But right now, the USA is threatening Venezuela. And I want to remind you all of something that happened. Back in 2019, when Trump was in office the last time, he was threatening Venezuela. And there was a false flag. I don't know if people remember this, right? People have short memories. But, Venezuela was having a food crisis imposed on the country by sanctions by the United States, etc. They're no longer having a food crisis, but they were back then. And so the United States and its allies got a whole bunch of people together, and they got a food truck at the Colombian border. And they made a big show of they were going to drive this food truck over the border. And the food truck was lit on fire. And they tried to say that Maduro had lit the food truck on fire, and that would be a reason to invade Venezuela. And then what happened? Well, Gray Zone, that was on the scene, showed in their video that it was actually the anti-Maduro people themselves. It was the United States allies that lit the truck on fire. They're the ones that actually lit it on fire. They caught the video. So they weren't able to invade Venezuela because they lit their own food truck on. They lit the food truck on fire. It was a false flag, an attempted false flag. And people who say that false flags never happen, like, go and look at what happened. I mean, Max Blumenthal and Gray Zone, right? The Venezuelan food truck incident in 2019. This was an attempted false flag. It actually happened, right? And the New York Times even did a story. Footage contradicts the claim that Venezuela. So don't tell me that false flags never happened, right? I mean, it actually was a false flag. We're supposed to believe every time you hear false flag, you're supposed to go, oh boy, I believe that. Well, the New York Times admits that there is video showing they lit the food truck on fire themselves to try and make the case for overthrowing Venezuela. So that happened. So keep in mind, the USA was at one point going to invade Venezuela because they allegedly lit a food truck on fire. Israel just openly sent drones to attack a food delivery ship. Wasn't a false flag. The drones came and they lit the ship on fire. So how does this work? Also, let me add, we're constantly told in America that Venezuela is a brutal dictatorship. It's a brutal dictatorship. I don't know how that works because I've been to Venezuela. People who don't like Maduro have protests all the time. They run in elections. They have whole neighborhoods they control. There's a guy named Juan Guaido who was running around claiming falsely that he was the president of Venezuela and had the USA backing him, and he never got arrested or any criminal charges or anything. People in Venezuela protest against the government all the time. However, in Britain, this weekend were a bunch of people who were dragged to jail because they held up signs that said, "I support Palestine Action." There's this Palestine group in Britain called Palestine Action that has engaged in some illegal activities to support the Palestinians, to oppose Israel. And they've made it a terrorist group. They've designated this group as a terrorist organization. And so if you hold up a sign that says, "I support Palestine Action," you get arrested and charged with promoting terrorism. So thousands of people in Britain have been arrested just for holding up a sign that says they support Palestine Action. Now tell me, how in the world, let's be real. The USA supports and funds Israel, and Israel openly lights food delivery trucks on fire while they starve the Palestinians. Israel is above the law in Britain. People get grabbed, and Venezuela allows, they didn't light their food truck on fire. Venezuela, they allowed dissent and people who disagree with them all the time. Like, Israel is a country that gets a complete free pass. And I wanted to talk about that. The other thing is that Ben Shapiro, who's this right-wing, talking head who's supposed to be so smart, right? He's just, he's just, your typical like bookish, smart millennial. He might be a millennial. He might actually be younger than me. Who he's just, he talks like this and he knows a lot of facts. He says facts don't care about your feelings. And he, is on his laptop. He's just, we've all met this guy. There's like a million of this guy, but because he's rich and he lives in LA and he's a Zionist, and, he's just, he's a rich Zionist kid with a laptop, they've decided to make him like this famous superstar. Like no one wants to debate, Ben Shapiro. Well, Ben Shapiro went on, a radio program, an African-American radio program, to debate the issue of reparations, talk about U.S. support for Israel. The conversation got interesting. I wanted to play that.
I think that's a really live and interesting conversation, and I think that it's totally worth having. I think that on a sort of public policy level, reparative policies don't tend to be nearly as effective as people want them to be, historically speaking.
They work for Jewish people.
In what way?
Jewish people that receive reparations.
You mean Holocaust reparations, for example, from Germany? So I think that first of all, that there was like a gigantic fight actually in Israel over whether Holocaust survivors should accept reparations from Germany, because the idea was that it's allowing them to expiate their sins of the past, and they shouldn't be allowed to expiate those sins, and it's allowing them to sort of buy off the history for 50 grand or whatever it is.
So who cares? How does that matter at all, right? So there was controversy in Israel about whether Holocaust survivors should take their reparation money. Well, that doesn't in any way refute the fact that they got it, and that has been beneficial to Israel, right? He's trying to make the case that reparations for African Americans is not justified. And the host there just pointed out Israel's gotten reparations. Israel's doing pretty well. And so he just says, well, there was debate about whether or not they should do it. Well, who cares? That's not a relevant thing in the conversation. But that's kind of his way of doing things, where he just, well, I can talk really fast and say things that are completely unrelated. So now he's gonna make some more points about why black people shouldn't get reparations, but Israel should get everything it wants. Okay, go ahead. I'm Ben Shapiro.
But that is not the reason why Israel has become successful economically. Like just on a success level, the reality is that cutting people checks rarely makes them more successful from the government. What usually makes people more successful is a determined attempt to become the things that the meritocracy demands of you. Right, so there were no long.
People just have to work hard and be the things that the meritocracy demands of you. You just really work really, really hard. That'll make you really, really famous and rich. And Israel's just like so amazing, and we work really, really hard, and that's what we do. I'm Ben Shapiro.
Long scale. Think the U.S. foreign assistance for Israel has helped financially.
Well, I mean, the U.S. foreign assistance for Israel actually is a bargain for the United States, because Israel doesn't need the money. I've said this before.
Well,
Israel,
give it to us.
I mean,
we'll take it.
That's fine.
The black community would gladly take it.
That's in it.
I can't speak for everybody.
It's like $3 billion a year. We should point out at this point that we spend, I think, $6 billion a year on our military bases in Japan, $5 billion a year on our military bases in Germany.
Now, he's lying there, actually, right? So U.S. aid to Israel is a lot more than $3 billion a year. It's a lot more than $3 billion a year. A lot more. Because not only that's $3 billion is just the check that's cut. On top of that, right, you've also got all the free weaponry the United States provides, all the intelligence support the United States provides. You have the fact that the FBI goes after and targets people who oppose Israel in the United States and around the world. You've got the fact that the US government has designated Israel's enemies like Hamas and Hezbollah as terrorists and uses American government resources to then target those entities, right? There's a huge amount, a huge amount, you know, you know, a huge amount. There's a huge amount of U.S. support for Israel, just a huge amount. And it doesn't all just come directly in the form of funds, but on top of that, right? In the United States, Israel has a huge apparatus that is set up to bring money in from the American people. It has a huge lobby organization that is set up to make politicians support Israel. It has huge programs where they take American college students and fly them to Israel for propaganda tours. I mean, Israel gets a lot out of the United States other than just that $3 billion a year. But if it was just that $3 billion a year, that has nothing to do with U.S. military bases in Japan because those are U.S. military bases. Israel is supposed to be a foreign country. And it seems that what has been said by many politicians is that Israel is basically just an outpost of the United States. And that's what he's admitting there. And if that's the case, what's going on here? Why is the United States therefore not held directly responsible for everything that Israel does? There's a lot there we could unpack. And the way the USA rails against Venezuela, the way Israel gets away with monstrous crimes and atrocities. I mean, there's a lot that could be said. A lot that could be said. But I wanted to mention something else that happened. So today, Donald Trump did a press event that was very much aimed at the evangelical Christians that support him. And it was an event about religious freedom. And this event, I wasn't expecting much from it, right? And this is an issue where I honestly, for a long time, just based on my life experiences, I really have very little tolerance for this kind of rhetoric, or at least I used to, right? And so basically this event that Trump had, this event he had was to talk about how Christians in the United States are being persecuted. And when I was a kid, right, I grew up in a really small town. It was almost completely Republican, almost completely evangelical Christian. And they violated the church and state rules all the time, right? Every Christmas play, we ended up having a manger scene in it. Every Thanksgiving, we had a minister come in and give a sermon. They violated left and right. We had teachers going on religious rants in class. And, it was really sickening, honestly. And, we had 2 prayers at our graduation, not just 1, but 2. And at the same time that they were completely violating the whole thing about how in America, we're not supposed to have any government funding of religion. They would violate it left and right. But at the same time, they'd be saying, "Oh, we're so persecuted. Oh, we're so persecuted. Oh, see." Yeah. And so I really got generally triggered and annoyed with this kind of rhetoric. And I still find it ridiculous, right? People in little towns where they have prayer in school, they have ministers coming in, they're violating the Supreme Court rulings left and right. And they always say we're persecuted. And I remember when I was in college, I went to a college that was technically a religious institution. Most colleges in America are. There are what they call Bible colleges that are like explicitly religious, that are often not accredited. But like most colleges, even like Harvard and Yale and places like that, are technically founded or set up by a religious institution. The college that I went to was not a Bible college. It was a normal accredited university in America, but it was technically run by the Methodist Church, right? And so, it had a chapel, whatever. And it was not a Bible college, but it was technically a religious institution. And I remember that, I went to there was a conservatory of music associated with the college, right? And actually, the conservatory of music, the people there were much smarter than most people at my college because I guess it was quite competitive to get into the conservatory of music. So a lot of my friends were actually in the conservatory of music because it was a much more prestigious place to go, right? A lot of the people that went to my college were business majors or majoring in sports medicine or whatever, but to get into the conservatory of music, you know, was a high achieving thing. And like their musical theater program, a lot of people that are on Broadway come out of it and stuff. So I knew a lot of people in the conservatory of music, even though I studied political science. And I remember they had all the conservatory students, when they graduate, they have a recital where they play their music, and they often bring their families to it. It's a big thing. So I ended up going to a friend of a friend's recital just because it was something to do. And it was in the chapel, right, at this Methodist affiliated college. And I was in the chapel of this Methodist affiliated college, and I'm sitting there, and, you know, they had the recital, and then they had food afterwards, like a reception. So people are lined up and they're eating the food, and the father of this family, I guess they were deeply conservative, you know, stops everybody and he shouts really loudly at the top of his lungs, "I know it's not politically correct, but we're going to pray." And I remember thinking, what do you mean it's not politically correct? You're at a Methodist college. You're in the chapel of a Methodist college. No one is oppressing you, dude. And so it would always annoy me when evangelical Christians were like, we're persecuted, we're oppressed. I mean, I'm just like, no, you're not, right? And there are court rulings in the United States that say because we don't have a state religion in America, that it is not okay for government-funded institutions to promote religion, right? They can't impose on anyone's free exercise. They can't stop you from being religious. But government institutions are not supposed to endorse or embrace religion. They're supposed to be neutral on matters of faith. But, you know, all our money says in God we trust. Well, that's pretty well an endorsement of theism. And I mean, you can't really follow this. I mean, and we don't, right? Christmas in America is a federal holiday. Well, I mean, that's not a secular holiday. I mean, it is for some people, but it's, you know, there's all kinds of things that we do in America where it's weird because most countries, and this is actually quite interesting, most countries in the world technically have state religions, right? They don't have theocracies, but they have a state religion. Britain, for example, right? It's the Church of England is the state religion. But Britain's a very secular society. Technically, yeah, Church of England, whatever, you know, but they don't care, right? And so that works. America has always had the separation of church and state, and that goes back to our founding because 9 out of the 13 colonies had state religions. Did you know, right? The United States, 13 colonies that came together to found America. 9 of them had state religions. Virginia was a Catholic state. Maryland was a Catholic state. Massachusetts was Puritan. Pennsylvania was Quaker. And so when they made the Constitution, the only way they could get all 13 colonies to sign on to it was to guarantee there would not be a state religion, because there was fear on the part of the Catholic states that you know, the Protestant majority would try to impose Protestantism as the state religion. There was fear on the part of the Protestant states that somehow the Catholics would bring in a lot of people and then they would impose Catholicism. So in America, our separation of church and state has a particularly interesting thing. It's the fact that we are such a fanatically religious country has always meant that it's just like an agreement that we have that the government can't pick a religion, because if it does, everyone except for the people of that religion will be really, really mad about it. And since we're also religiously devoted, it's a problem. In Britain, you can have the Church of England be the state religion. And yeah, in the time of Oliver Cromwell, people were really mad about it. But nowadays, no one's religious. It's a very secular society. So, whatever, you know, state religion. In America, we don't have a state religion. However, if you live in a small town, if you live in a conservative area, they treat Protestant Christianity as the state religion all the time. And they get away with it, and it's technically illegal, and no one says anything because they don't want to be shunned by the community. And I grew up in one of these towns. That's part of why I was an atheist in high schools. I was just so tired of seeing you know, the very conservative religious views of the people I grew up around imposed via the school, via the government. And then another aspect of it that I found to be really, really annoying was that they were constantly then saying, but we're oppressed, but they're taking away our freedom. And it was infuriating. And that is generally a critique I have of the Christian right, that, you know, I still maintain that critique of the Christian right. I am I live in New York City now, and I'll tell you, my views are not exactly as they used to be. And I have rediscovered my Christian faith. But on top of that, I see things from the other side now to some degree or other. It's more nuanced. But growing up, I just was very much an advocate of the separation of church and state. And I was very, very much disgusted by the kind of rhetoric we heard from Trump today, because I just found it to be a ridiculous doublethink. And even when I was in college in a more kind of liberal atmosphere, I told you my college was technically a Methodist college, but it was a very secular accredited university. It wasn't a Bible college. I do remember at my college, they started the Atheist Humanist Association, the AHA. And I attended meetings of the AHA because it was cool. I also went to the Progressive Christian group, even though I was an atheist at that time. I went to anything that was like against the mainstream, anything that was left, right? I was a communist activist in college, and so that was what I did. And I remember the Atheist Humanist Association was formed, and there were a number of religious students on the campus that were upset by the group existing. And it was like they just didn't understand that, you have the freedom to have your group, right? You're part of the Campus Crusade for Christ, and the Catholics have the Newman Center, and the Jews have Hillel, and the progressive Christians have the Progressive Christian group, and the atheists are allowed to have their group too. And they just couldn't wrap their heads around this. No, them having this group, this atheist group on the campus is oppressing me somehow. No, it's not, right? This is America. This is a pluralist society. And the college, obviously at some Bible college, you couldn't do that, but an accredited American university that does receive government funding, it can technically be affiliated with the church, but if you want to start an atheist club, you're allowed to. And they just couldn't understand that. No, it was, that can't be there. This is offending me as a Christian. How dare they? They're just like the woke people are now, right? It was like somebody having a view and expressing a view other than theirs was somehow oppressing them. And so it is something I've always kind of hated about the religious right, is they don't understand that we don't live in a country where we have an official state religion, and there's a reason for that. And this notion that you're not allowed to have the prayer that you want in government school, that's not oppressing you, right? And it's things like that, that always kind of made me furious about this. Now I live in New York City, and I will say now I see things through the other side to some degree. I still maintain that criticism, though. I still think, because we have the separation of church and state in America, because having a state religion in America would be an absolute nightmare. Generally government funding and endorsing any particular faith is not good. However, I do live in New York City, and there is a weird, I will say, among kind of liberal minded people, there is this belief that if you are religious, you are a bad person. Right? If you are Christian, if you practice Christianity, you must be in the Ku Klux Klan. You must be a white supremacist. You must be evil. And that is a belief that a lot of liberal middle-class people have. They won't admit it, right? They won't acknowledge that they think that, but that's what they do, right? It's kind of like that quote from Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi, right? Supposedly he said, when I hear the word art, I reach for my rifle. Well, these people, it's like when they hear the word God, they reach for their weapon, their, angry, complaining device or something. They just are triggered by religion existing. Anyone who's religious must be stupid, must be a bad person, is somehow oppressing them. It's a similar thing, right? And I never, you have to live in a place where there is a very, very liberal majority that is very, very, offended by people of faith. You have to live in that kind of environment to know that kind of thing exists. And it does. I mean, it absolutely does. And so anyway, I saw the event that Trump did, and I don't know. I'm not as opposed to this kind of thing as I used to be, but at the same time, I don't agree with kind of the message that Christians are oppressed because we don't have, official prayer in school and that kind of thing. But anyway, the important thing is, though, this is what Trump said at the event, right? And this is just an offhand comment, but whoa, this is just a snippet. He gave a general speech about he wants prayer in school, he wants the Bible in school, all your standard Republican stuff. This is what he said.
For those people that are a little bit naive or not well read, there is a tremendous anti-Christian bias. We don't hear about it. We don't think about it. You hear about anti-Semitic, but you don't hear about anti-Christian. Now you have a...
Whoa! Did you hear that? Did you hear what he just said? That was not in the script. Mike Huckabee did not want him to say that. Mike Pence did not want him to say that. He took the event in a very different direction. He gave a standard, just a standard, we want prayer in school, Bible is good, the standard thing. But then he threw in a hot potato. Let me play that one more time.
About anti-Semitic, but you don't hear about anti-Christian. Now you have a strong...
Whoa! Yeah, and it's funny because that audience are all evangelicals who are some of the biggest supporters of U.S. support for Israel, one of the biggest, loudest screaming anti-Semitism people. But Trump basically just said there, there's one group that we bend over backwards to never offend, and there's another group that is offended routinely nowadays in America, and that's out of step with the neocons. That's out of step with most of the people in that room. I would say probably most of the people in that room didn't agree with what Trump said there. And you have to wonder, was Trump just talking out of his ass? Was that in the script? Was that like a little bone he was trying to throw people? Was he trying to throw a bone to Marjorie Taylor Greene? What in the world was that? That was absolutely wild. So I will say that I did not see that coming. I did not see that coming. That was particularly wild. Generally at those events, you just hear, conservatives are oppressed, Christians are oppressed. We need to have the Bible back in school. You don't hear that being dropped, right? And that's big. That's big. And part of the wokeism has been, kind of this widespread belief that Christians are bad, that Christians are bad. And that's been kind of in some atmospheres, not everywhere. In some places, that's become more, widely promoted. But the idea that, if you said that about Jews, right, that would immediately be labeled anti-Semitism. In fact, criticizing Israel, which is not about Jews. And in fact, in Colombia, it was mostly Jews that were doing the criticizing of Israel. It was Arab students and Jews, right? I went to those protests at Columbia University that were supposedly so anti-Semitic. Almost all of the non-Muslims that were participating were Jews. So even Jews themselves criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic and has to be shut down. So yeah, very, very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. And I will say, when it comes to Columbia protests, right, I went there, I covered them, I did many stories there. And the people who think those were Jew-hating protests are out of their minds. Out of their minds. Those were protests of Jewish leftists. There's a lot of leftists that are Jewish, that oppose what Israel's doing. The idea that those protests were somehow threatening Jewish students, anti-Jewish or something, that was not the reality. And that seems to be, there's whole sections of Twitter that are just convinced all those students did was gather together and hate Jews all day long. And that there's even lawsuits against Columbia University maintaining that those students were oppressing and hating Jews somehow. So, we live in very, very, very strange times. I did not see Trump doing that. And again, I don't know what that was about. And again, every so often you see something like that. And this is Trump trying to get points maybe with the Marjorie Taylor Greene, because when it gets down to it, a lot of Trump supporters are not pro-Israel. That doesn't show up because conservatainment, as they call it, the Daily Wire and Fox News and all of them are very, very pro-Israel. But among conservatives, you have a lot like Candace Owens. You have a lot like, Tucker Carlson. You have a lot of people that are not pro-Israel on the conservative side. And so even though that gets covered up, Trump, I guess maybe he felt he had to throw them a bone. Maybe that's what that was. I don't know what it was. I really don't know what it was. Also, I did have a little bit of fun. Trump was confronted about this Hyundai raid, which I still don't know what to make of it. South Korea says they're furious about it. Trump says, no, South Korea doesn't care. It's no big deal, which, is pretty weird. But, these Hyundai workers in Georgia have been arrested by ICE, are going to be deported from the country. So, they asked Trump about it. And when he was getting on his helicopter this morning, and I had fun with this. Basically, he said, we need more people in America who can make complex things. He said that basically, we Americans, we can't make complex things like batteries anymore in America. We don't have people who can do that. And so we need them to come. You need the South Koreans to come and teach us how to make batteries. Very, very odd thing to say. I think American companies can make batteries. But I had a little bit of fun with it. Yeah, this is the fun I had with it.
Oh, but who would? I don't even have any good skills.
When they're building batteries, if you don't have people in this country right now that know about batteries.
What do you mean?
Like nunchuck skills, bow hunting skills, computer hacking skills.
Our people to do, complex things, whether it's battery manufacturing or computer manufacturing or building ships. So we're going to look at that whole situation.
Girls only want boyfriends who have great skills.
So yeah, Trump wants us to get some battery making skills, nunchuck skills, bow hunting skills, computer hacking skills. Trump wants us to get some great skills. That's what I immediately thought of. So there you go. There you go. That's by the way, that's from Napoleon Dynamite, which was kind of a hit movie, a couple decades ago. It was a hit movie, a kind of a comedy. And that was one of the lines that everyone remembered was, you got to have skills. You want to get a girlfriend, you got to have skills. Got to have skills. Well, Trump says, in America, we need some skills, some battery making skills, whatever. Anyway, I just had fun with that. I enjoy these kind of things. I enjoy this kind of stuff. I really, really do. And you just have to laugh on some level. I mean, every day just gets more absurd. We are living in very, very absurd times. I mean, Israel's burning the food trucks. I wanted to mention this, okay? And I saw this before we get to the next item here. This is very disturbing. The main pro-Venezuelan, entity on social media, online, for years has been a website called Venezuela Analysis. I'll link it here. Venezuela Analysis. And it's a great page. It's a good resource about anything about Venezuela. VenezuelaAnalysis.com. And it's very good. It's got a lot of information. It's just a really, really good page. It's full of information about Venezuela. VenezuelaAnalysis.com. So right now, as you know, the USA has, sent, this big fleet to threaten Venezuela. Well, their Twitter just got taken down. Their Twitter has been hacked and removed. That is extremely disturbing. Absolutely disturbing, right? If there's ever a time people need to be hearing from Venezuela Analysis, it's now. And yet, now they've had their Twitter account removed. Elon Musk is completely engaging in censorship. That is absolutely horrifying. The other thing is Kim Iverson, who is a good friend of ours. She's had me on her show a number of times, a journalist who's very anti-war, etc. She is now being stalked and facing a huge amount of harassment. She hasn't gone into detail exactly, but her home has been broken into. Someone tried to buy a car, apparently, with her personal information, posing as her. And she's being threatened and harassed at this point. And that's because her show is very anti-Israel. It's gone in a very, very anti-Israel direction. And she is facing some very, very serious targeting and harassment, to the point that people have actually broken into her house. The fact that people have tried to buy cars in her name. I mean, she's dealing with some very, very extreme harassment because she's critical of Israel. So I wanted to mention those things. We've gotten our fair share of harassment as well, but we continue. But I just wanted to share that with folks so that people knew that was happening. So another thing we've talked about a lot on these streams is Russia and China. And Russia and China just signed a huge natural gas deal. China is going to buy a huge amount of natural gas from Russia. And this is two major countries that are being locked out of the world economy by the United States. And so they're getting closer to each other, the BRICS, et cetera. And we celebrate the new economy. This was the banner that we put on, up at the convention, the CPI convention. That was the banner. Long live the great unity of the people of the world, trade, not war and sanctions, celebrating the BRICS, celebrating the Eurasian alternative. And we did recently hear Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov touch on it.
And our relations with People's Republic of China is that of multilateral partnership. Russia dates back decades with Russia, with India and China.
Yeah, and that, Russia and India and China are cooperating. Now, the Russian Revolution brought us both modern India and modern China. Now, in the case of China, that seems pretty obvious. In the case of India, it's not as obvious. What happened is that, the Russian Revolution of 1917 took place. And the Second World War was ultimately the result of that, right? There was the Roaring 20s. World War I, the crisis of World War I brought us the Russian Revolution. That brought the Bolsheviks to power. After World War I, you had the 1920s, the stabilization, but then you had a big economic crisis, the Great Depression. And out of the Great Depression, you got the economic crisis where there was a big threat of communist revolution. So Germany became a fascist military dictatorship under the Nazis. And ultimately, you had World War II, which is the response to a capitalist crisis. And out of the Second World War, China, was invaded by Japan. The Soviet Union came to the aid of China. The Red Army, the communists, were one of the main people fighting the Japanese invaders. And because of that, you got, the People's Republic of China. And after the war, they wanted to form a coalition government, but the KMT nationalists were backed by the United States. They wouldn't allow the communists to join the government. They tried to actively disarm the government. So there was a civil war. And then ultimately, the People's Republic of China came into existence. And when the People's Republic of China was formed, it was an ally of the Soviet Union. It was a communist-led country. India is a little bit of a different case. India was a colony of the British at the time of the Second World War. It was part of the British Empire. And the communists in India, they followed the line of the Soviet Union. They aligned with the British to fight against fascism. And there were, Japanese attacks in India, and the communists, heroically fought the Japanese in India and different places, etc. So, India then, after the Second World War, you had the independence movement led by Gandhi. India got its independence, and the Soviet Union became a major friend of India. And this is very interesting. Even though the government of India kind of was pro-Western in some instances, pro-Soviet and others, the Soviet Union just kind of latched on to India and invested very heavily into India, built steel mills in India, helped bring electrification to India. And there was a partnership between the Soviet government and the government of India in the 1950s and 60s. And people don't realize that. We tend to think of India as just kind of a poor capitalist country, but after their struggle against colonialism and after they got their independence, the Congress Party of India, which is still around, it's the more moderate party in India. They kind of called themselves a socialist party, and the Soviet Union did a lot to develop their economy. They never became a socialist country. They never had a revolution. They maintained capitalist property relations, and it's still very underdeveloped. There's big chunks of India that are still very, very underdeveloped. They have a huge industrial working class in India, but there's still very, very big chunks of India that are impoverished, people living in desperate third world conditions. It's still a very poor country. But there was efforts by the Soviet Union to aid and help India develop. And India is a very, very important economy in the world today. It's not a socialist country. It's very much a capitalist country. But the basis of the modern Indian economy comes from the Russian Revolution. And that's something that is not obvious because India has never, changed property relations. What's also interesting is that we know that, during the early 60s, China and the Soviet Union had the falling out. And that was the Sino-Soviet split that was caused by Khrushchev. Khrushchev basically cut off China because China was speaking up against Khrushchev. and was opposing his policies of accommodating the United States. They put out their critique of the general line of the communist movement. And because China was criticizing Khrushchev cut ties with China. And so there was a pretty bitter falling out between China and the Soviet Union in the 1960s. And that really kept going until the fall of the Soviet Union. It really didn't get repaired until after the fall of the Soviet Union. But as Russia's economy restored itself under the leadership of Putin, and as China has continued to grow, they have repaired relations. The important thing about Russia-China relations now is they're not based on ideology. It has nothing to do, because Russia is no longer led by a communist party. It is not about ideology. It's not, the Soviet Union sponsoring another communist country. It's very different. It's that Russia is a strong economy today, and it's rebuilt its economy since the fall of the Soviet Union by centering oil and gas at the center of it. They've become an energy exporting giant. China has built itself up by becoming an industrial power. They make half the steel in the world. They make, great phones, biggest telecommunications manufacturer. China is an industrial manufacturer, and China needs to import lots of oil and gas to keep their industries running. Whereas Russia needs to sell their oil and gas. And the USA puts sanctions on Russia and makes it hard for them to sell their oil and gas. Russia was going to sell natural gas to Germany, and so the USA blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Russia needs to sell its oil and gas. And China, on the other hand, they need to import oil and gas. And the USA is always militarizing the South China Sea to threaten China, right? If China can't get the oil and natural gas it needs, their industry will come to a stop, right? They are dependent on oil and natural gas imports. And that's why the South China Sea is so important to them, right? There's a lot of drama in relation to Vietnam and some contested islands, in relation to the Taiwan Strait, in relation to the Philippines, because China has to make sure that no one can cut off those oil tankers, right? And so that's why the South China Sea is so important to China. It's why they maintain a very important military force there. They don't want their oil supply to be cut off. China needs oil and gas. Russia's got it, and Russia needs to export its oil and gas. They're a match made in heaven. It has nothing to do with ideology, and that's why it's going to be much harder to break them apart. And there are people in the MAGA movement that are convinced that they are going to break Russia and China apart. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because economically they need each other, and the United States has cut both of them off to ridiculous extremes. The United States has tried to devastate both of their economies, tried to block China from making its own chips, tried to block Russia from selling its gas, blown up the Nord Stream pipeline, put sanctions on Chinese chip manufacturers, funded Tibetan separatist movements. And so both countries are being antagonized by the United States, and they both have big economies, and they both trade with each other. It just makes sense. So I just don't see Russia and China getting pulled apart. It's just not going to happen. They're very close to each other, and they economically complement each other. So I don't know on what basis anyone maintains this illusion of pulling those two countries apart. India is also an industrial country, and it's close to Russia, and there are border disputes between India and China. But India and China also have an economic relationship. It's not completely hostile. Now, Noah, shout out to Noah if you're watching, and a few other people pointed me towards the crisis in Nepal right now. And that is very interesting. Nepal is a country that, doesn't like China. Nepal is a country that doesn't like India. And Nepal, for many years, it was a monarchy, and there was a Maoist communist insurgency against the monarchy. And then the monarchy collapsed. And now the Communist Party of Nepal is one of the biggest parties. And the Maoist communists, they merged with the unified Marxist-Leninist Party, and that now the communists in Nepal are a big part of the government, and China is a heavy investor into Nepal, and Nepal is in the Chinese camp. And it seems that there are protests going on in Nepal right now regarding social media freedom. And those protests are getting very widely celebrated in mainstream media. So Noah was saying to me, it looks like a color revolution. Looks that way to me as well. It looks like, there's a fear on the part of the Nepali government that social media is going to be used to sow unrest. And so they put some restrictions on it. And now there are protests against that, that are being widely promoted in Western media. So it looks to me like this is, a color revolution, but we'll see what happens, right? We'll see if this continues to escalate. I know there were some people that were killed at one of these demonstrations, and so there's some confusion going on. I don't quite know what to say about it, but it looks to me like some kind of color revolution may be attempted by the pro-U.S. wing of Nepali politics, that wants to pull them out of the Chinese camp. But who knows? Who really knows? Who really knows? We're going to pay close attention to that situation. There is some instability going on there. So, I'm paying attention to it for sure. And, you never know with these things. Sometimes things start in one way and then they go another way, right? Right? That unrest in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean one thing. Sometimes something can start as a color revolution and turn into something else. And other times, so we just don't know. Right. And the situation is still developing. But yes, there appears there was some protests. There were some people killed, and we're watching the situation. And we'll just have to see what develops around that. So the other thing, I did want to mention is that we have been reading from this book that I wrote, The New Communist Movement, Party Building in 1970s America. We've been reading from this book, and we're almost done with it. And I'm probably going to read the rest of it here for you tonight. And then we'll go to the roll call, and then I'll take people's questions. I think that's what we're going to do. So if you've got a question for me, send it in. Questions can be sent via Rumble Rants. But the best way to send them is via Buy Me a Coffee. And I don't see any questions that have come in via Buy Me a Coffee. I do see that there have been a couple. There have been 2 questions that have been sent in as Rumble Rants. So we have some questions, but think of questions you want me to answer in the second half of the show while I finish our book. I am going to finish the book tonight because it's the last section of the book where it really starts with 1978, and I will warn you, it gets a little depressing. It's about kind of how the new communist movement, de-escalated and faded away. But it kind of ends with some insights. So I'm going to finish the book tonight, and then we'll do the roll call, and then I will answer people's questions. So please send questions for the second half of the show. Give me something to talk about in the second half of our program. Buckle up. We are going to finish the book tonight. So here we go. Outside of Detroit and a few other parts of the country, the new communist movement largely failed to build a base of support among the population. Most of the U.S. public, especially white Americans, viewed communism as evil, anti-Christian, and totalitarian. The new communist movement groups worked hard not to appear like counterculture hippies. Many of the NCM groups required their male members to have short hair, and in some cases, their female members to wear only dresses and not pants. The groups forbid drug use and often proclaimed homosexuality to be bourgeois decadence. Regardless of how much the NCM activists tried to break with counterculture aesthetics, they remained fringe. With a few exceptional breakthroughs, such as the Detroit auto plants and the West Virginia coal fields, the NCM only seemed to recruit in marginal spaces, such as college campuses and prisons. The American industrial workers had high wages and comfortable lives, and they did not want to join a revolution. The idea that the bulk of Americans were irredeemable racists who benefited from imperialism became a common and popular response to the NCM's failures. Noel Ignatin coined the term white skin privilege as a way of explaining why white industrial workers did not stand in solidarity with their black co-workers. A book called Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat, was published in the early 1980s. by a person identified as Jay Sakai, who claimed to have been an NCM activist who became disillusioned with the potential of the white working class. The Weather Underground had more or less always believed the bulk of the American workers were irredeemable racists, with a kind of brief reprieve from this kind of thinking during the 1976 Hard Times Conference. In 1977, Clayton Van Lydegraaf went head-to-head with other leaders of the Weather Underground. As the group came to terms with its irrelevance as an illegal organization that set off occasional bombs, internal fighting got ugly. Lydegraaf circulated an audio recording of Bernadine Dorn crying as she read out a confession and apology for racism, crimes against the people of the world, and trying to wreck the women's movement. In the tape, she also denounced her husband, Bill Ayers, and other prominent leaders of the organization. After getting pretty badly burned in the internal fighting, Mark Rudd turned himself in to the FBI in September of 1977. At the time, his father told the media, "You get a little bit too old to be a revolutionary." That same year, Lydegraaf and 4 others walked away from the Weathermen to form the Revolutionary Committee. The FBI, which had been closely monitoring them for several years, arrested them in November of 1977 in order to prevent them from blowing up the home of a California state senator. The group of 5 people that had broken away from the Weather Underground apparently had planned a string of bombings to make a name for themselves and their new organization. They took a plea deal and they served 2 years in prison. San Francisco, which had been a center of the 1960s counterculture, was a stronghold of the new communist movement organizations throughout the early 1970s. The various sects battled each other in the streets in an atmosphere that was much darker and more pessimistic than the idealism of the 1960s upsurge. The role of the FBI in playing various communist factions against each other is pretty well established. 2 Trotskyite groups, the National Caucus of Labor Committees and the Spartacus League, both gained a reputation for engaging in violence against other organizations, but they were far from alone in this practice. Many Maoist and anarchist sects existed simply to expose, torment, threaten, attack, and harass other radical organizations. Ramparts suddenly disappeared without warning in 1975. The publication had been a staple of communist and radical politics, not just regionally, but nationally. The magazine had been sued in 1972 by the Pacific Bell Telephone Company for publishing copyrighted technological information in an article about how to prevent one's phone from being tapped by law enforcement. The magazine had become more and more focused on sexual matters in the early 70s, giving a lot of attention to the gay rights movement, feminism, and content related to personal advice about sex. San Francisco had also become a center of the gay rights movement. Among the organizations that operated in San Francisco was the Democratic Workers' Party, headed by Marlene Dixon. This was a communist organization that emphasized feminism and gay rights and functioned in a semi-clandestine manner. It had a presence mainly on the West Coast. In 1974, George Moscone was elected mayor. He won against rival Democrat Dianne Feinstein, who viewed him as being too far left. Moscone was a social democratic figure who drew support from labor unions and some NCM, New Communist Movement activist groups, though most did not back him, seeing him as a liberal reformist. Moscone aligned himself with the gay rights movement and the first openly gay elected official, City Alderman Harvey Milk. Both Milk and Moscone received massive support from a strange pro-communist religious sect called the People's Temple. People's Temple was led by Reverend Jim Jones, a Pentecostal minister who led a mostly black congregation and proclaimed himself to be the combined reincarnation of Jesus and Lenin. Jim Jones was a personal friend of Communist Party leader Angela Davis and had frequently preached sermons praising the Soviet Union and China. Jones staged faith healings and miracles and claimed he was a prophet sent to earth to announce the death of God and free humanity from the, quote, sky god and usher in heaven on earth. Moscone appointed Reverend Jones to be the head of the city's housing board. Soon, deeply disturbing revelations about the internal activities of the People's Temple surfaced. In response, Jones began moving his flock to Guyana, where he established a socialistic agricultural commune. November 18th, 1978 was the date of the infamous Jonestown mass suicide, when Jones and over 900 of his followers drank cyanide or were shot. The incident, known as the Jonestown mass suicide, horrified the world afterward, and on November 27th, George Moscone and Harvey Milk were assassinated inside of San Francisco's City Hall. The shooter, former police officer Dan White, received only a 2-year sentence, invoking the infamous Twinkie defense. San Francisco was gripped by the infamous White Night riots among the gay community, and Dianne Feinstein became the new mayor. The tragic events of late 1978 seemed to be setting the stage for much wilder events in the coming year. It's worth noting that the Jonestown incident intensified the cult scare of the late 1970s, spawned by the rise of new religious movements. Ted Patrick and his associates formed an organization called the Cult Awareness Network that engaged in the practice of kidnapping people when their relatives felt they had been brainwashed by a cult. Deprogrammers would hold people against their will and attempt to change their religious beliefs, charging their family members thousands of dollars for the service. The Unification Church, an anti-communist religious organization from South Korea, was rising in prominence during these years as well. The group presented itself as a peace movement and used the language that sounded similar to 1960s countercultural groups, but was aligned with the hard right-wing World Anti-Communist League based on the island of Taiwan. The Unification Church recruited college-age students to engage in anti-communist activism through its campus activist group, CARP, Collegiate Association for Research of Principles, and its larger anti-communist group, Causa International. The Carter administration launched a series of investigations into the organization as being an alleged front for South Korean intelligence as part of the Koreagate scandal. None of these charges could be proven. The group's leader, Reverend Sun Myung Moon, was eventually imprisoned for tax violations, with many speaking up against the prosecutions, including left-wing voices such as Minister Louis Farrakhan and civil rights leader James Bevel. The primary targets of the Cult Awareness Network were religious groups, but communist groups were not spared. It was not uncommon during the late 70s and early 80s for a college-age student to become a communist and then their parents to hire kidnappers to forcibly abduct them and browbeat them into renouncing Marxist politics. Some communist groups, such as the Democratic Workers' Party and the Revolutionary Communist Party, seem to have been more singled out for harassment by the anti-cult movement than others. Eventually, Ted Patrick went to prison, and the Cult Awareness Network was sued out of existence for violating the religious freedom of many legal adults that it had kidnapped. Steve Hassan, one of the primary leaders of the Cult Awareness Network, who used his brief involvement with the Unification Church as the basis for his expertise, supposedly on cults, remains widely promoted in U.S. media. He regularly appears on CNN, and his book, The Cult of Trump, was widely promoted in U.S. media. Hassan functions as a background advisor to prominent socialist breadtube personalities such as Vosh, ContraPoints, and H-Bomber Guy. A number of reports claiming to show KGB involvement with the Cult Awareness Network have been circulated, but reports also indicate the involvement of U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies in their activities as well. The various religious and political groups operating in the United States during these years were often seen as potential pawns in intelligence schemes and had different covert forces seeking to manipulate their behavior and to nudge them in different directions. The economic downturn of 1978 had many new communist movement activists convinced that their decade of unsuccessful work in the factories would soon pay off. The 1976 Hard Times Conference had used the slogan, "Hard times are fighting times," and anticipated that the militancy of the Great Depression would return to the U.S. working class in response to economic hardship. However, among the bulk of the white working class, the opposite was the case. The U.S. living standards had been consistently rising since the end of the Second World War. The response of most U.S. workers to the sudden downturn was to become more conservative and to blame liberal reforms. As the so-called Reagan Revolution set in, the NCM activists moved in tragic desperation. The death of Mao Zedong and the rise of Deng Xiaoping also confused them. China had already confused them with its pro-U.S. foreign policy. When Deng Xiaoping arrested the Gang of Four and declared the Cultural Revolution to have been a mistake, many NCM groups denounced China outright. The Communist Party Marxist-Leninists solidly backed Deng Xiaoping and embraced the new leadership in Beijing, only to be told a few years later that China no longer wanted a relationship with U.S. communist organizations. The CPML dissolved, with members fighting over what to do next and going in various directions. The Revolutionary Communist Party split in 1978, with China being a central point of debate. Those who remained loyal to Bob Avakian denounced China as having restored capitalism. Those who split seemed to maintain some support for China, or at least distance themselves from the Gang of Four. Those who left the RCP called themselves the Revolutionary Workers' Headquarters, and fistfights between the two factions took place across the country for several years. Avakian expelled every member of the RCP except for his trusted inner circle, and he forced anyone who wished to rejoin the RCP to reapply for membership and clearly demonstrate their loyalty. The new RCP functioned in a much more clandestine and secretive manner. Literature, such as Red Papers 8, published by those who resigned or were expelled, indicates that internal issues and debates about strategy played a much larger part in the split than merely disagreements about China's new leadership. Label Bergman, a veteran of the Communist Party who had been Avakian's personal mentor, joined with Mickey Jarvis and a number of others to form the Revolutionary Workers' Headquarters. The RWH attacked Avakian personally on issues related to his mental health and alleged that the organization was becoming a cult of personality around him and not aimed at building a base among the working class. They wrote, Avakian's brand of political instability increasingly caused the RCP to deviate from the task of joining the working class struggle as emphasized at the founding Congress. For Avakian, the easier and therefore more important task was to keep his work on the level of rational knowledge so he could play the potential role that was best suited for a man of his mental ability and stature in the party, not to mention his personal state of mind. Avakian couldn't lead the RCP to deepen and develop its line because his line no longer leaps beyond rational knowledge back into revolutionary practice. In our party, there are two lines and two headquarters. Avakian is convinced that without his genius, there can be no real party in the U.S. Idealists are never bothered by the questions reality poses. Avakian decried much of the RCP's activism as economism and began orienting toward more adventurous street confrontations, much like the SDS weathermen he had once opposed. Avakian wrote, to make such a rupture with economism was very revivifying and very liberating for me and our party as a whole. Our whole practice changed enormously. In one section of his autobiography, Avakian references a revelation that he had at a Jimmy Buffett concert. As the struggle with the Mensheviks, Mickey Jarvis, Label Bergman, and others was developing, I went to a Jimmy Buffett concert. There was a certain rebellious edge, and it made me think, we've gotten into tailing after the more immediate sections of the workers, but there are workers, including the white workers, who are more alienated and more rebellious than many of the more stable and conservative-tending workers, among whom had been focusing much of our work. In a way, this Jimmy Buffett concert was part of provoking questions in my mind politically and ideologically. When the embassy of the People's Republic of China opened in Washington, D.C. in 1979, RCP members trashed it, smashing windows, spray painting pro-Mao and anti-Deng slogans on it, and throwing small explosives. In the following days, the RCP organized a Death to Deng Xiaoping rally outside the White House when Deng met with Carter. Two RCP members, enabled by the U.S. Air Force and Secret Service, infiltrated White House grounds and disrupted Deng's press conference with Carter. Avakian and 200 other members of the RCP were arrested and hit with heavy criminal charges. At the time, the RCP was heavily infiltrated by an entity called Western Goals, an intelligence service staffed by members of the John Birch Society that worked with the FBI to track communist organizations. The FBI and the John Birch Society opposed Carter normalizing relations with China, seeing China as a communist-led country that they blamed for the global heroin trade. The RCP, it appears, was being used by deep state elements to work against Carter and the formal establishment of U.S.-China relations. And at the same time, the RCP published a fake issue of the October League's newspaper, The Call, in which they baited the group for its pro-Beijing stance and its support for gay rights. The Los Angeles Times also misquoted Avakian as threatening the life of Jimmy Carter, leading to a lengthy Secret Service investigation into the RCP and its activities. When the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was seized, the RCP positioned itself as taking the pro-Khomeini stance. RCP members went to right-wing rallies condemning Iran and provoking right-wing crowds to attack them. Many RCP members were injured or arrested during these provocative actions. In early 1980, the RCP launched a campaign for a general strike on May 1st, dubbed May Day 1980. From January to May of 1980, RCP members across the country got into scuffles with police and random working-class people, with hundreds of arrests taking place. RCP member Damian Garcia ripped down the U.S. flag at the Alamo in Texas and replaced it with a communist flag. He was murdered in Los Angeles several days later. The dead body of another RCP activist in New York City was found at the bottom of an elevator shaft. On May 1st, 1980, RCP activists Steve Yip and Glenn Gann poured red paint on the U.S. and Soviet ambassadors at the United Nations and shouted, "Down with U.S.-Soviet war moves." They were both sent to prison for several years for attacking a foreign diplomat. Avakian eventually relocated to Paris in 1982 and applied for political exile status. The French government denied him official status as a political exile, but allowed him to remain in the country under undisclosed terms. He led the RCP from France and did not return to the United States until 2003. November 3rd, 1979 was the date of the Greensboro Massacre. Members of the Communist Workers' Party in North Carolina held a Death to the Klan rally and sent the KKK a threatening letter challenging them to, quote, show their faces. The KKK responded by coming to the rally and shooting and killing 5 people. The Klansmen were acquitted in court. Among their car caravan were multiple FBI informants and an undercover agent of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The Communist Workers' Party held very provocative protests against the Democratic National Convention in New York City when Jimmy Carter refused to bring federal charges against the Klansmen who murdered their comrades. The CWP members broke into restaurants where Democrats were eating near the convention site, shouting, "Carter, Kennedy, you can't hide. We know you're on the Klan side." They also disrupted Jimmy Carter's acceptance speech. The New York Times reports, a few minutes into the president's speech, a sharp staccato burst out, like that of firecrackers, was heard in the area of the president's right. It appeared they seized a woman who had apparently set off a string of firecrackers. Another woman in the balcony section began screaming and shouting. She was later identified as the widow as Dale Sampson, the widow of William Sampson, who was killed in Greensboro, North Carolina, last December 3rd in a march by the Communist Workers' Party. Fraser Glenn Miller, one of the Klansmen who participated in the caravan in Greensboro, North Carolina, eventually shot up a Jewish community center in Overland Park, Kansas, decades later in April of 2014, killing 3 people. At his trial, it was revealed that Miller had spent most of his life living under the protection of the FBI and the Federal Witness Protection Program. The remaining leaders of the Weather Underground, Bernardine Dohrn, Bill Ayers, formally surrendered in 1980. Most of the charges were dropped by the U.S. Department of Justice due to the extreme misconduct the FBI had engaged in while investigating them. Bernardine Dohrn eventually went to prison for 7 months for contempt when she refused to testify against other members to a grand jury. The members of the Weather Underground who refused to surrender with the rest of the group called themselves the May 19th Communist Organization. They conducted a series of bombings, prison breaks, and armed robberies throughout the early 1980s, often coordinating with the Black Liberation Army. By 1985, almost all the organization's members had been arrested or imprisoned. The early 1980s marked a significant moment in the history of American communism that can be rightly called the Great Retreat. In the aftermath of a decade of work that showed little progress, China's political shifts, and the right-wing turn in American politics, many people turned away from Marxism-Leninism altogether, and those who remained communists abandoned approaching the broad masses of people. A key factor in moving people away from communist politics was the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which formally became the Democratic Socialists of America in 1982. The fact that many NCM organizations began to dissolve in the late 70s and early 80s created an opening for Michael Harrington, one of the State Department socialists of the Lyndon Johnson administration, who'd been mentored by the Trotskyist Max Shachtman, to win over confused and demoralized people with an anti-capitalist orientation. Many of the organization's top leaders had very open and direct ties to U.S. intelligence. Irving Howe had been one of the leading academics promoted by the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom, with his work published in Partisan Review magazine. He was frequently featured by mainstream publications like the New York Times Book Review as a Marxist who condemned anti-imperialists. Gloria Steinem, the leading feminist voice in America, was also a founding board member of DSA. She openly brags about her relationship with the CIA that started in the early 1960s when she infiltrated communist youth festivals. Amid all the confusion as various NCM groups dissolved or split, a well-funded publication called In These Times, staffed by members of DSA, was circulated and made arguments using Marxist language that trying to form a communist organization in the United States was pointless. Max Elbaum points out, DSA began with more than 30 chapters that had at least a small activist core, and the organization was able to maintain a presence in several grassroots movements, as well as participate in the post-1980s ferment within the progressive wing of the Democrat Party. The formation of DSA established social democracy as the dominant trend on the U.S. socialist left. With lots of funding and a soft approach, the DSA organizers would de-radicalize new communist movement members and woo them into mainstream Democratic Party politics or to lives as harmless academics, no longer seeking to build a revolutionary organization. The rising star of DSA was Bernie Sanders, who began ascending in local politics in Vermont. Many NCM radicals had already turned against the Soviet Union and the various anti-imperialist movements that were aligned with it because of China's denunciation of Soviet social imperialism. Getting these activists to go a bit further and denounce Marxism-Leninism altogether in favor of some kind of egalitarian vision of democratic socialism wasn't very difficult, especially as the global communist movement seemed to be in decline. Doug Frazier of the United Auto Workers began holding conferences under the name of an organization called Progressive Alliance that was funded by UAW money. And the forces that launched DSA had been cooperating with him for some time. After Reagan infamously invoked the Taft-Hartley anti-labor law to break the PATCO strike of air traffic controllers in August of 1981, the AFL-CIO saw a threat and called a national demonstration of labor unions called Solidarity Day on September 19th. The rally involved 400,000 labor union members, but Max Elbaum notes that the influence of communists on the day's events was minimal. The remnants of the party-building movement, along with the rest of the left, exerted no influence on the action's demands or strategy. Left participation was essentially limited to helping bring co-workers to the action and distributing literature to those who attended. Harold Washington's campaign for mayor of Chicago in 1983 and Jesse Jackson's campaign for president in 1984 attracted many communists and former communists, and this got them closer to Michael Harrington and his associates, who argued that electoral politics and building a socialist faction of the Democratic Party was the way forward. Jesse Jackson included Amiri Baraka and his League of Revolutionary Struggle in the Rainbow Push coalition that he created for his campaign that focused on Black community issues. Many other NCM organizations went into Jesse Jackson's campaign in 1984 as their membership and influence was dwindling. Though through the Jackson campaign, many NCM activists shed their communist politics and joined DSA or just became regular Democrats. The Communist Workers' Party politically shifted in different directions during the 1980s. The group developed a very close tie to the Workers' World Party, with Sam Marcy and Jerry Tung becoming close friends. The two organizations co-sponsored the People's Anti-War Mobilization protest in 1980. Jerry Tung published a book, The Socialist Road, the same year, basically articulating a worldview similar to Sam Marcy's global class war theory. The book said that the USSR and China were both socialist, but led by a, quote, revisionist bureaucracy. However, the Communist Workers' Party and the Workers' World Party sharply differed on the issue of gay rights. The Communist Workers' Party felt that homosexuality was, quote, a form of social sickness, a form of social perversion. It is a form of bourgeois ideology which appeals to the petty bourgeoisie because of its appearance as sexual freedom. Workers' World Party was increasingly identified with the gay rights movement. In addition, Workers' World Party did not regulate the sex lives of its members. And when Jerry Tung became aware of Workers' World Party members having extramarital affairs with members of his organization, he was horrified. When Marcy clarified that he had no intention of regulating the sexual behavior of consenting adults within his organization, the talk of merging and the formal alliance between the two organizations came to an end. For a time, Communist Workers' Party members frequently got arrested for getting into scuffles with white supremacists. Before changing its name to the New Democratic Movement, the Communist Workers' Party denounced Noam Chomsky as anti-Semitic and began working with liberal Zionists and others against critics of Israel. The Communist Workers' Party became increasingly conservative, mandating that its women not wear pants and that every member join a church and begin teaching Sunday school classes. The Communist Workers' Party endorsed Jesse Jackson in 1984, and the following year formally stopped being a communist organization and became the New Democratic Movement, a social democratic community activist group. The New Democratic Movement lasted only a few years before its members went their separate ways with individual local projects. What remains of the Communist Workers' Party can be found in a variety of Asian American nonprofits linked to the Democrat Party in New York City and in California, the most prominent of which is called Asian Americans for Equality. Former Oakland Mayor Gene Kwan and New York City Council member Margaret Chin were both prominent members of the Communist Workers' Party before becoming regular Democrats with significant support among Asian Americans in their respective cities. In Greensboro, North Carolina, a large African American church called Beloved Community Center, headed by Reverend Nelson Johnson, a former member of the Communist Workers' Party who witnessed the 1979 massacre, functions as a center of liberal activism. The church sends delegations to Cuba and seems to fit some anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist teaching into its overall liberal Christian activist worldview. The 1984 Jesse Jackson campaign also managed to undo the communist politics of many in Amiri Baraka's League of Revolutionary Struggle. The group dissolved, and the few who remained communists began calling themselves the Socialist Organizing Network. In 1986, the Democratic Workers' Party collapsed amid cult allegations and demoralization, expelling its leader Marlene Dixon and liquidating its assets. The bulk of what was left of the DWP merged into Democratic Socialists of America. The group had been the target of the Cult Awareness Network for quite some time, and apparently it was in the process of receiving funding from the communist government of Bulgaria and rebranding as the Alliance Against American Militarism, functioning as a think tank in Washington, D.C. The sudden breakup of the group was likely the work of U.S. intelligence agencies, who detected its new international ties and coordinated with Steve Hassan's anti-cult deprogrammer networks. Janja Lalich, a former member of the Democratic Workers' Party, was rewarded with a position in the anti-cult academic circles, receiving grant money and awards from various foundations linked to Steve Hassan's cult deprogrammer network. In addition to those who just abandoned communism altogether, those who remained communists retreated from any effort to win over the bulk of the American people. The experience of the 1970s and the right-wing turn of the country in response to the economic downturn cemented the idea that average Americans were just not recruitable, and that the communists could only recruit openly function among certain specific marginal arenas of society. Former members of the October League, the Revolutionary Workers Headquarters, and other NCM groups formed the Freedom Road Socialist Organization in 1986. The Socialist Organizing Network and former followers of Amiri Baraka dissolved into Freedom Road in 1994. The group orients its members to get jobs in labor unions and other liberal NGOs and try to maneuver within them, while attending secret meetings with other members to struggle over political line. A breakaway called Liberation Road, which is much less anti-imperialist, operates in a similar manner. Freedom Road Socialist Organization members had their homes raided by the FBI in 2010 as part of an investigation into Palestine solidarity activism. An organization and publication called The Line of March emerged in the 1980s as a kind of academic and literary voice of former NCM activists assessing where to go. The group began shifting to support the Soviet Union and its allies in the Cold War and printed a number of different books and magazines for intellectuals interested in communism. The group maintained the radicalism and focus on third world liberation found in the NCM, but oriented its members to support the Democrat Party and to engage with the Communist Party USA as allies. The group called itself the Anti-Dogmatist Non-Revisionist Trend and earned the nickname Left of Moscow for its new international line. Line of March seemed to have been very much a literary, academic, and non-activist formation. At the end of the 1980s, its members gradually trickled away from communism, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. Some of them joined the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, formed by Angela Davis when she resigned from the Communist Party in 1991. An organization called the Provisional Communist Party operated in secret for several decades, organizing a number of benevolent associations, such as the Eastern Farm Workers Association, the California Homemakers Association, all unified under the name the National Labor Federation, or NATLFed. The group developed methods of fundraising and providing services to low-income workers while recruiting college-aged radicals to be full-time organizers. The group's offices in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, were raided by the FBI in 1984, and several members were imprisoned for possessing forged documents. The offices were raided again by the New York City Police Department in 1996, and a cache of illegal weapons was discovered. The group has faced a slew of cult allegations, and what's left of it operates in several parts of the country as small nonprofits providing services to low-income workers. Members are forbidden from openly talking about communism, and the group continues to be stalked by Steve Hassan's anti-cult networks. In the early 1980s, the Revolutionary Communist Party announced that only the lumpen proletariat had revolutionary potential, and that most U.S. workers were, quote, bourgeoisified. The RCP focused very much on building a culture of appreciation for its chairman in exile, Bob Avakian, and was known for burning the U.S. flag at protests, eventually getting this act legalized by the U.S. Supreme Court in a 1989 ruling. The RCP agitated around police brutality and maintained a visible presence around Black nationalists and Black activist circles in general, despite its members being overwhelmingly white. The RCP was able to consistently attract college-aged radicals, maintaining a network of bookstores in major cities. The RCP held rallies against Ronald Reagan called No Business as Usual. In 1987, they formed an organization called Refuse and Resist, declaring that the U.S. was drifting into fascism as George Herbert Walker Bush was elected president. The RCP seemed to have a well-developed scheme of declaring Republicans to be fascists and organizing alarmist, hysterical demonstrations against them, buying ads in the New York Times, and having rallies as a way of fundraising from liberals. This tactic continues right up to today with Refuse Fascism protests against Trump run by RCP members, though membership is dwindling. Bob Avakian is over 80 years old, and a large chunk of the membership was expelled in 2008 when Avakian's New Synthesis was declared to be a new stage in communist theory, higher than the teachings of Marx, Lenin, or Mao. Only 2 RCP bookstores remain open at this time, but Avakian did manage to have a high-profile hour-long interview with Cornel West, played on National Public Radio, and a public event with Dr. West at Riverside Church on November 15th, 2014. A small faction called the Rayo Light Group, or the Revolutionary Organization of Labor, has recruited a few prominent labor unionists to its ranks. It publishes a newsletter and holds a very secretive conference to discuss Marxist-Leninist theory and maneuver within the labor bureaucracy once a year. The Prairie Fire Organizing Committee originally started as the above-ground wing of the Weather Underground, and it continued to operate throughout the 1980s and 90s after Ayers and Dorn surrendered. The group emphasized white skin privilege and the notion that solidarity with third world armed struggles should be the focus. And it published a magazine expressing its views. The group was primarily made up of college students who were in awe of Dorn and Ayers for their radical past. Prairie Fire members raised money for members of the Black Liberation Army and the May 19th Communist Organization who remained in prison. The group became less and less visible, with its magazine ceasing publication during the 1990s and its website taken down in 2010. Many former communists became college professors. Their organizations dried up, and the movement experienced a downturn, and they went to grad school. They now get grant money to use their Marxist background to write academic papers or books on gender oppression, white privilege, and other critiques of U.S. society. Community colleges and public universities around the country are staffed with people who once sold Mao's Red Book in their 20s and now teach undergraduates while slipping in edgy talking points about racist, sexist white males and settler colonialism. The tragedy of the new communist movement is that the actions they took from 1969 to 1980 were more or less correct. They went to the broad masses of Americans, especially those who worked in the once vast industrial apparatus of the country, with a communist message. They went out of their way to distinguish themselves from the liberals and to raise a class-conscious, anti-imperialist message. Unfortunately, the ground was not fertile. the bulk of the U.S. working class was still gripped by anti-communism and reveling in the economic gains of the post-World War II economic expansion. The ruling class was able to transform the economic crisis of the late 70s into a right-wing shift by blaming the cultural changes and demoralization that followed the 1960s upsurge. The demoralization following a decade of limited successes and big defeats led many to just move away from communism entirely, and those who remained communists to retreat from the real mass work and to view the masses with contempt. Trauma plays an important role in the weakened state of affairs among communist organizations in the United States at this time. Decades of rejection from white workers and violence inflicted on them by Reagan Republicans has many of the most radical sounding anti-imperialists clinging to the Democratic Party as their protector and screaming that Trump and all who back him are fascists. The idea that the bulk of the white working class are irredeemable racists, that Christianity is inherently right-wing and fascist, and that it is necessary to align with the Democrats against conservatives has been cemented into the minds of the leaders of various communist groups that remain throughout years of painful experiences. The groups that continue to function, some rooted in the NCM, others with different roots, do not engage in mass outreach to the bulk of the population. Organizations work to maneuver within the labor bureaucracy, within liberal NGOs, and on college campuses or black radical spaces. They are often shrouded in a very deep paranoia and delusional understanding of the political system. In addition, the organizations have become accustomed to not seeing growth or success and continue to operate in a routine way, growing smaller and more irrelevant each year. Youth in their late teens who become interested in communism will join one of these groups and after a year or two realize that they have no plan for expanding and no interest in breaking out of their routine. They then quit and move on with their lives. And among many Americans, joining a communist group is viewed as a kind of college phase people go through in their 20s before moving on. However, the times we are living in are very different than the late Cold War when this great retreat took place, and this state of affairs set in. In 2024, the bulk of the population is opposed to wars and is economically suffering. Anti-communism is being actively taught and emphasized by the far right because the Cold War is fading from American memory. The U.S. public is suffering in an economy that has deteriorated, and racial integration has expanded to the point that the kind of tribalist right-wing backlash of decades before is much harder to foment. Interest in socialism and communism is widespread among millions of Americans, and the economic successes of China and other anti-imperialist countries are quite hard to conceal. The problem is that the various communist organizations that remain are led by people who learned, quote, that winning over the bulk of the population is impossible, and who continue to operate on the assumption that they will always be marginal. Furthermore, the remaining communist sects all more or less hold on to a political understanding from the 1970s and 80s, not offering any solid analysis of Bolivarian socialism, contemporary China, the current economic crisis, and other issues that need to be addressed. In light of these circumstances, the urgent necessity is for mass work aimed at the bulk of the population to commence once again. The Center for Political Innovation aims to serve this purpose. And that's my book, The New Communist Movement, Party Building in 1970s America. A lot of information in there. I've done years of research on communist groups in America, and that is my history of the new communist movement of the 1970s. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'm glad you're all here tonight. So now we're going to do the roll call, and then I will answer questions that people have. So keep in mind that questions can be sent via Rumble Rant, Cash App, Caleb Moppin 22 on Cash App, or you can buy me a coffee. Your questions are what, help me pay my bills and keep all of this going. So Give me some questions to answer in the second half of the show. Names and locations. Names and locations. We got Penny in Minnesota. Names and locations, folks. Alyssa in Virginia. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? We got Ryan in Kansas City. Rise from Adelaide, Australia. Sydney, George Muniz. Names and locations. Names and locations. Jenny in Cincinnati is with us. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Brooklyn in the house. Phil is here. Anway in India. Jesus bless us all. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Names and locations. Names and locations. I assume that's applaud for the book. Chad in Spokane, Washington. St. David's, Bermuda. Names and locations. Names and locations. Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who's with us? Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Anybody? Anybody else? Anybody else? Anybody else? Names and locations. All right. Well, in the second half of the show, I answer people's questions. So we've got 3 questions that have come up, and I will answer those. Those are 3 Rumble rants that have come in. But the best way to send questions is via Buy Me a Coffee. So if anyone wants to send questions via Buy Me a Coffee, that would be the best way to send your questions. Go to Caleb Mop and Buy Me a Coffee. That's a great way to send questions. Link is down below. Link is here in the chat. It's a great way to send the questions because that is just the most convenient for me. I did want to mention, so, after our CPI convention that we had, we convened an event. Red Illuminati in Jersey. Shout out to Red Illuminati. We convened an event that we call the Chicago Sessions. And at the event, I honored 3 fallen comrades, 3 people who've died. And then various members of our organization spoke. So I'm going to show, I just edited a big section from the, we got Vinny in the Bronx. I just edited a big section of our, of the Chicago Sessions. So it's going to premiere on this channel at 2 a.m. tonight. And I'm going to put it on now for y'all, just so you can see. This is from like the day after our convention. All the CPI members, we gathered for a great event that we had. It was like a long Q&A session called the Chicago Session. So I'm going to show some of that.
To begin today's session by honoring 3 people, none of whom were CPI members, but were great anti-imperialist activists who passed on. There's a tradition that comes out of the Cuban Revolution that I guess in the military, when they're taking roll, they say the person's name, and then the way to say present in Spanish, they say presente. And a way of honoring the deceased is to you then say their name, and everyone shouts presente because they're still with us. Our comrades are still with us. The first person I would like to honor was a guy named Marty Goodman. Marty Goodman was a man who was born into a communist family in New York City. He got involved in the struggle against the Vietnam War as a young man, and he was really involved in building peace demonstration. He was in the Socialist Workers' Party, and he was in some other organizations that came out of that. He was a transit worker. He drove the subway train in New York City. He actually saved someone's life on the subway. So a woman had tried to commit suicide and jump in front of the train, and he jerked the train to a stop and saved the person's life. And so the city of New York gave him an award for this, and he turned down the award in protest of the way the transit workers were having their treatment cut, and he kind of embarrassed the MTA authority, turning down their award. But the reason that I know Marty Goodman is because in the final years of his life, he was dedicated to freeing Julian Assange, and that became the cause that he was obsessed with. And every week they had a protest in front of the British UN mission, every week. And I worked near there at the RT studio that used to be there, and I would walk by him, and sometimes he would be the only one there with a sign, "Free Julian Assange." He'd be the only one. And sometimes there'd be 5 people, sometimes there'd be 10 people, and sometimes it was just Marty. And I would run into Marty on the subway, and I would run into Marty in my neighborhood. And he always wanted to give me a newspaper, and he was always dedicated to free Julian Assange. And he died 3 months before Julian Assange was freed. And so when Julian Assange got his freedom, I thought of Marty Goodman and how happy Marty Goodman is in the next life to see that the cause he dedicated himself to in his final years finally had fruition. Julian Assange was able to return home to be with his family. And so Marty Goodman is a great comrade. Marty Goodman, presente! Marty Goodman, presente! I wanted to talk about another comrade, another friend who died this year. It was a guy named Paul Gilman. Now, Paul Gilman was an activist in New York City, and he ran for Congress and for various offices as a member of the Green Party. Paul Gilman's story is fascinating. Paul Gilman, in the early 1980s, he was convicted of something related to marijuana. And he was a young man who smoked a lot of pot, and he ended up going upstate to prison in New York State. And in prison, he read every book he could get his hands on. And he learned about Mao Zedong and the Chinese Revolution. He learned about the civil rights movement, the black struggle, and he came out of prison as a dedicated activist. And he was at every anti-war demonstration and every rally in New York City. He was somebody that I just found to be very, very amusing. One time I gave a class on the history of Mao. He came with a stack of books because he was just so excited to share the information. But one story about Paul Gilman that I want to share is that he had a son who was disabled, who was kind of special needs son. And one time he took his son to a film screening, and his son, who was disabled, was kind of, being loud and making a scene or something like that. And he was very embarrassed, and he was very apologetic. So he apologized to the party leaders and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And they said, "It's no big deal." And he said, I'll never bring my son to an event again." And they said to him, "No, it's no big deal. You'll know if your son is ready for it." And every time I saw Paul, he would tell me that story, because that shows you how much an act of kindness like that, an act of compassion. They could have said, "Never bring your son to an event again," but they said to him, "No, you'll know." And they were very kind in response to his son being a little bit disruptive at the movie showing. And every time I saw Paul, he would mention that to me, because that shows you how much an act of human kindness can go with people. And, I would run into Paul on the streets of New York City, kind of like I ran into Marty. And sometimes Paul was in a homeless shelter. Sometimes he was homeless because he was an ex-con. He had a criminal conviction. It was hard to get a job. Other times he was doing well. But yet, despite, struggling to keep a roof over his own head, he would still run for office as a Green Party candidate every time. And he was with the Palestinians. The last time that I saw Paul was at a pro-Palestine rally in May. And Paul went up to me and he gave me condolences on the death of my wife's mother. He said, "I saw on Facebook that your wife mentions that her mother just passed. I'm so sorry to hear that." He gave me a big hug, and that was the last time I saw Paul, because he died a couple weeks later. And I think about Paul, who, from a prison, from a dark place, discovered a life of struggle and came out. And I think about the glow that he had in his eyes and the hope that Paul always had. Every time I saw him, he was full of optimism and energy. That's what we need. Paul Gilman, presente. Paul Gilman, presente. Paul Gilman, presente. And the last comrade I want to give a tribute to is someone who died quite a long time ago. I think he died in 2011. His name was Artie Rosen. And Artie Rosen was a member of the Workers' World Party, and he'd been a founding member of the Workers' World Party. And he was actually quite wealthy because he was an expert on economics, and he'd started a currency trading company on Wall Street. He was very good at trading currencies. He'd made quite a bit of money, but communism was his life's goal. And he was a Jewish American, but everywhere Artie went, and I knew him at the time he was retired, he went with a Palestine baseball cap on his head and a stack of communist newspapers in his briefcase. And everywhere he went, he was wearing his Palestine baseball cap, and he was giving out the newspaper to everyone he could. And every time you saw him, he would tell you about, I was on the subway and, someone saw my Palestine hat and they gave me a thumbs up and I just got them a subscription to the newspaper. Or I was walking through a neighborhood and there were a group of Arab American teenagers and they saw my ball cap and they gave me a thumbs up. And every time you saw him, you heard from him good news, positivity, hope for the movement. And, you know that as a Jewish guy, an older Jewish guy in New York City wearing a Palestine ball cap, he must have gotten a lot of negativity. There were probably a lot of people that gave him a thumbs down or told him to go F himself or something like that, but you never heard about that from Artie. I think about Artie, the reason I'm bringing him up, even though he passed, quite a few years ago, is because I think about, in the next life, as he looks on us now, he's got to be so overjoyed to see all the pro-Palestine demonstrations that are happening now, that people all over the country are marching for Palestine, and people like him that are of Jewish descent are also marching for Palestine. He's got to be just absolutely overjoyed. Artie Rosen, presente. Artie Rosen, presente. Artie Rosen, presente. And the reason that I'm opening our session talking about this is because movements are made by people. Movements are made by people who give their lives to it, people who are active organizers. And part of what we've been trying to transition out of in CPI is we don't want to be an online organization. We very much want to be an in real life organization. And in real life means getting to know people. It means getting to struggle along people. And there are so many beautiful people who've given their lives to anti-imperialism. And we need to honor them and we need to know them because they're a model for what our lives can be, right? The revolution is not podcasts. The revolution is not tweets. The revolution is people who give their life to the struggle. And so we want to keep these comrades with us and look at them as a model of people who lived for a higher purpose, believed in living in the sake of others, and sacrificing for something that they believe in. We want to hold them in our hearts as we go out and build a movement in our time. So Marty Goodman, presente. Paul Gilman, presente. Artie Rosen, presente.
It's not easy. All these other little groups are doing is easy. They've been doing the whole Donald Trump is the KKK, like they have the posters, they haven't upgraded stuff for the past 10 years, so I always tell Caleb, like, I almost joined one of those groups back then, but I'm glad I didn't, so it's just like, we're doing the honest work and that's going to take longer. In the long run, it's rewarding, so I enjoy kind of the reward I get afterwards, because the whole Kamala book, passing out the book, people are unaware about the whole thing with Kamala, and it's like we were the ones that, or Caleb's book gave all of us awareness of what she's about in her life and everything. And I gave a book to a family friend. She's conservative, and she was surprised, and she's like, "Who's Caleb?" And she saw him in like right media and all this stuff, and she was like, wow, like, this is crazy. And like, she told my aunt, like, watch out, tell Gabby to be careful and everything. And she went all like kind of berserk with that. But I mean, I kind of just wanted to say that what we're doing is we're on the right track. It's going to take a long time to accomplish what we want to accomplish. But like I said, I feel good doing the right thing. If I didn't feel good, yeah. So like,
poverty in that region. I myself would be interested in helping native reservations, doing food drives, doing cultural preservation techniques, recording languages, helping people preserve their own cultures in these areas. I'm sure every single person here can think of something that they would love to do in that regard, in their own little niche, in their own way. So I am looking forward to the future of CPI and how we will be able to grow, I think, at one point exponentially once we're able to have the resources and the power to help the average person and show what we're really all about.
Wow, you guys inspire me a lot. Just want to say that. This has just been an amazing whole week. I do want to talk to you, maybe get some warning messages from you, because starting with who are you and why CPI, basically. And that's kind of what I want to mention right now. And sometimes I do things on the fly, so that's why I have notes. So I try not to go by the notes, but sometimes there's things I don't want to leave out, and that's why I write things down when I'm spontaneous. But I think one of the things that we do a lot in LA, and we all do really as a group, is outreach. Where even when you're out and about doing social things, you're always talking to people. Always. And I find the more I do outreach, almost every time CPI comes in a conversation. And it's so important to be face to face, and I have to tell you, it looks a lot better seeing you in person than it does just seeing you online all the time. So, okay. I'd like to see us do this more often, and please come to LA. So I asked myself, who am I? Well, there's a lot of things. I wear a lot of hats, so I put in the context of activism. The first thing I did, I guess as an activist, was be a media ambassador for Adopt a Minefield, which is a program of the United Nations of the USA. And they asked me to be a media ambassador. I worked in the Hollywood Press Corps.
Sorry, Dan, could you speak up a little bit?
I wrote an article for their international newsletter, and I worked in the Hollywood Press Corps 1 year. It was a great experience. I met a lot of people from all over the world. And I learned that, when people will tell you, you can't change the world, I realized that was absolutely not true. What we did as a community is, I think we pretty much stopped the creation of landmines. Now, it went to drone bombs, but anyway, what we did stop, we planted that seed, the horrible things that would be in the ground that were discovered, decades later, in Vietnam, etc. So we only had certain countries that we worked in. But I also, after that, I think it was Occupy Los Angeles. So since Adopt a Minefield put me in their media team, I thought that's where I want to go. If I can't do arts and education, that's where I'm going to go, and that's where I ended up. And I learned more about economic injustice. I realized how ignorant I was of many things. Didn't really know more of the details, believe it or not, of the Banking Act, the Glass-Steagall Act, and I learned, and that and so many more things that it just boggled my mind. I go home at night, get on my computer, and oh my God. And that's the first time I saw an image of this gentleman here, the hippie here, sitting here. It was Occupy Wall Street. And the next thing that I did was working with KPFK, because I realized the importance of building community, and someone asked me if I wanted to be on the committee, and then I was the acting chair of their community advisory board. I didn't have to get involved in their infighting politically, and I could just communicate with the community and get their feedback about what they liked and didn't like about community radio. And from there, I created my own cable access television channel because a brand new studio opened in the city where I live. And I like to learn. I'm an educator as well as an entertainer. I like to learn. I like to ask questions, and I like to go directly to the source. So when David Bowie died, what was it like working with David Bowie? I talked to the person that worked with him more than anybody else. What was it like working with the Beach Boys and the Monkees? I interviewed people from the Wrecking Crew. What is this thing called the freedom dividend? I talked directly to Andrew Yang about it. What is the Green New Deal in your perspective? I talked to Jill Stein. What is this thing called CPI? And I talked to this gentleman here.
This is one of those things where, I know it's difficult. There's times where, I just have family that says just give up. Live your life biologically. Find a career that you'll love, that will pay off stuff, and just die, just be conformed to your life, and just allow yourself to die, and allow your whole family to die. That's how I see it. And I'm not gonna allow that. They're gonna have to go through all of us in order for them to get to my livelihood and our livelihood. It matters. The working class people matter, and that's why I'm tired of hearing the left, the right. We're none of that. We're innovationists. We want to get the stuff done as soon as possible. And there's times where I'm optimistic at times, but like I said, talking to you guys, I feel better because I know we're doing a big project that's gonna be for everybody. So like I said, hopefully our projects are big, hopefully everything that we do pays off, because sometimes you have people in your ear saying, give up, stop doing what you're doing, get that career going, girl, go girl, you go girl, but that it's all lies, it's all a scheme, it's all quick money paycheck, and live paycheck after paycheck, and it's no, I can't, I have no other choice, we have no other choice at these times, freaking all these grocery prices are crazy, you know. But like I said, it's a whole movement we gotta create, and like I said, it's just I'm feeling thankful that like everything that happens for a reason, and it's a Sunday. And I like to thank God that we're here together, reuniting, and I just like to say thank you, God, for all the blessings you have for us, and amen.
Amen.
Yeah. Okay, so we talk about seeing the masses come alive, and to be empowered, and that requires them having the knowledge and understanding that and knowing the struggle and knowing their own struggles to be out and go and take a course of action. And so we've done that through like with Gabby helping to build flyers across Chicago, Penny distributing the Houthi books into the Muslim communities. But we need to find ways to interact with communities on a one-to-one basis, and I'm wondering if CPI could see itself doing activities like mutual aid, cookouts, hosting dinners like these, at local community centers, in order to be able to talk to people in a local community one-to-one, and figure out what their needs are, what their concerns are, as well as providing material relief, for those in need. And in doing so, we get to know a community better and find a way to organize with them in order to create the movement, the self-determination, in order for them to come alive and move forward. Does CPI see itself doing activities like that on a local basis in their local neighborhoods?
Yeah. Well, the answer is an astounding yes.
The next thing I did was the pandemic, and I was convinced I am not staying inside my house all day long in California where the sun is shining and there's still the beach, okay? So, and I found that there were a lot of people that were going through a lot of serious trauma about what was going on. And I just felt the need not only for community, which I had to travel a long way to get to on the west side of Los Angeles, but I also felt the need to be more educated about what is going on here. We're not being told the truth. So I've co-founded a group called Natural Health First, and really, health is about mind, body, and soul. All of it, right? So it's really important on all levels. And the next thing I did was meeting and interviewing Caleb Maupin, and realizing that there was a need in Los Angeles, because I saw the potential for a movement that Occupy Wall Street, Los Angeles, and all around the world. They dropped the ball. They didn't do it right. They made a lot of mistakes. I saw the mistakes. I can write a book about it. But I said, this guy's on track. He gets it. He is exactly on point. And he was there too. And he popped up in my algorithms probably because of our mutual friends, the Combo Couch. And I started watching his live stream, and I thought, this is it. This is it. You're talking about economics. Most people don't. I grew up middle class, lower middle class, poor, and nobody talks about, economics. They leave that conversation almost completely out all the time. Unless they see their taxes getting raised, then they want to talk about something, So, I think what we need, why CPI for me? Well, that's just the background story of it. I think we also need a new renaissance. We need not just music, but remember, or arts or painting or whatever from the original one, but it's also economics, it's also spirituality, it's also political, and maybe even more so, it's about what we're doing, community building, to make all that happen. And I also learned from all my work that it's so important don't limit yourself. Local stuff, national stuff, international stuff. I can see CPI in Europe, in Asia, in Russia, in China, etc. Get my drift?
Yep.
This, but like Margaret Mead said, you don't need the majority of people. All you need is a significant number of people, whatever that is, and you can change the world. I saw it just from the landmine crisis, and it happened. It's not a myth. So, like CPI, also we need to focus on when we do our outreach. I think we need to focus on the 4-point economic plan. And remember, when you talk about the universe, spirituality, that's everything, and that's everyone. So it's not just any one group, and certainly not your ego or mine. Okay, that's another thing we have to have checks and balances on ego, right? So, and understand how we use words also, as well as what the words mean, understanding history, but also, as we do as well, understand what's going on, current events, and address things currently. Like, we don't want another years of lead, right? We want Ibrahim Traore to be more on the awareness, consciousness of people, to understand he's the kind of role model we need in this world right now, who's not afraid to speak up and take action. We need the Uhuru movement, right? Yeah. But we also need CPI, because... And I just want to say, again, thank you all. You are so inspirational to me. Sorry, I do get emotional when something is really important to me. Piggyback on what Caleb said, everybody just works together. It's just simply wonderful. And as far as my closing remark is, yes, we need to transition to something better. Do you know why? Because abundance is for everyone!
So yeah, now I'm going to start answering people's questions. Hope you all enjoyed that. We'll have the full Chicago sessions very soon. I think I've got like one thing left to edit. But yeah, it was a great time. We're having an event in January. It's going to be great. We're going to honor some good local friends of ours. We're going to have a long Q&A and everything. It's going to be pretty awesome. So you have to register to come to our event in January. So we're going to open registration for that soon. So I hope that you will be there. But yeah, let's start answering people's questions. So Gabby, she sent a super chat, Cash App, and she wants me to respond to a clip from Candace Owens. I haven't watched this yet, but she said it's 19 minutes into this interview that Candace Owens did. She wants me to respond to it. So here we go.
Coming up,
all right, 19 minutes in. All right, here it is. Gabby, I hope it's not anything that's gonna grind
Are these people, what happens to their remaining belongings? What happens to their ancestry? Do these people go in and take their belongings, these settlers that are running into there, and sell them in a foreign country? This is what I always think about the Bolshevik Revolution. You stole Christian art. You stole Christian jewelry. You mass murdered 60 plus million Christians. And then you exported yourself to America, and you started the Diamond District. That's a fact, by the way. Okay.
Wait. Hold up. Yeah, that's pretty damn weird. Yeah, so wait a second. So the Bolshevik Revolution destroyed a bunch of Christian art. They did. They destroyed churches. They were considered symbols of the old regime. But then Stalin built more Russian Orthodox churches than any other Russian leader in history. And they said they killed 60 million Christians. No, there was the Russian Civil War, in which a lot of people died on both sides. There was a famine. There was World War II. But there was no killing of Christians for being Christians. And then those people set up the Diamond District in New York. No. The people who set up the Diamond District in New York tended to be people who were against that. They were the people that were opposed to the Bolsheviks. And the Zionists, the Bolshevik Party was very, very strongly opposed to Zionism. And, they said that Zionism was one of the, was a reactionary trend of the Jewish bourgeoisie. And it wasn't until after World War II there was any communist Soviet support for Israel. And then that dried up very quickly. They supported Israel in 1948. And then the Soviet Union became the main funder of the Palestinian resistance. And this is a problem now. And this is where it gets weird, because it's like they label any criticism of Israel anti-Semitism. So people now, they don't, it's just like, okay, everyone's an anti-Semite. And if everyone's an anti-Semite, then no one's an anti-Semite. And so we have old anti-Semitic narratives about, the Jewish Bolshevik Revolution or whatever. We have old anti-Semitic narratives like that coming up. We have that coming up, and and this is, Zionism is not the same as communism. Communists were the main enemies of Zionism. The people who died in the Russian Revolution, the Russian Civil War, they weren't massacred because of their faith. Stalin built, churches everywhere. This is just, some things are true and some things are not, so, so I don't know. Yeah, I get frustrated when I see that stuff, Gabby, too. And it's like, on the one hand, I don't want to, have my politics resting on what people think of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's gone. And the woke left, they now claim the mantle of being communist, and they're toxic. So that's why we're innovationists. And, there are certain things about the communist ideology that, that lead to wokeism, right? The dialectical materialist philosophy is inherently destructive, and it pushes destruction for destruction's sake. Well, Stalin built more churches than anybody else. A lot of Russians believe that Stalin was a Christian. Yeah, it's pretty wild. It's pretty wild that she's just pushing, I think she's a trad Catholic, and she's just pushing, trad Catholic anti-Semitism, unfortunately. And, yeah, it is unfortunate that she gets that way because, if anti-communism is your worldview, you have to be on the side of U.S. imperialism. And a lot of libertarians are in denial about that, right? But it's like you listen to Alex Jones, it's like he lists all these CIA coups and all that. They're all against communists. And where's the libertarian free market country the USA is invading? No, that's what the USA imposes on countries. It brings capitalism. Oh, but it's not real capitalism. Okay, all right. Well, that's what you think. But, aside from this fantasy real capitalism that only exists in your head, there are governments that are opposing the dominance of the world by Wall Street and London. They tend to be socialist governments. They're not Marxist-Leninist governments anymore. They tend to be Bolivarian, Islamic socialist. You got Ibrahim Traore, right? But they're not bringing the free market, right? But if your worldview is that capitalism is necessarily always good, if your worldview is that communism is the greatest evil, if your worldview is that somehow woke people and the Soviet Union are the same, woke people in China are the same, you're just not in touch with reality. So I see a lot of that. Your typical right-wing podcast now goes like this. Don't woke people annoy you? And they go on and they say a lot of great things about how annoying woke people are. And then from there they say, well, didn't you know that woke people are all communists? Here's some woke person who said they like Karl Marx, or here's some woke person who calls themselves a socialist. And then they transition to the most cliche, standard, Mao killed a gajillion million people, Stalin killed a gajillion million people, and all of that. That's your typical conservative podcast now. And it's dumb because it doesn't take a genius to tell that China and the Soviet Union are not the same as woke people. It also doesn't take a genius to tell that the same lies that, they tell about Russia to get funding for Ukraine, the same lies they tell about Iran to justify the bombing of Iran are the kind of lies they told about the Soviet Union and the lies they tell about China, and that it's the same stuff. So it's frustrating. But it's like what they call the path of least resistance, right? People want to, when people are confronted with a challenge, they want to solve the challenge without having to do very much work. And unlearning years and years of anti-communist indoctrination is a lot of work. So if you just decide that what you don't like about the USA is communist, you don't have to challenge anything else that you know. So you don't like wokeness, but what are you going to do? Because you don't want to be at odds with the U.S. establishment. So the woke people are communists, and so by opposing the woke people, I can still be in line with the U.S. establishment. It's that kind of thing. Part of it is an age thing, though. Conservatives tend to be older. Younger people tend to be woke, and the conservatives grew up during the Cold War. And the world in the United States, the economy has gotten a lot worse since then. And they say, well, can't we just go back to the Reagan years when communism was bad and we were all united against communism? Part of it's a nostalgia thing. And I think it'll wear off with time because, gradually things are going to shift. But for now, that's the terms of the discourse. So it's unfortunate to hear Candace Owens talk that way. I like a lot of what she says about a lot of things, but and then she just starts talking that way. I hope her and I can have a conversation one day. That'd be great. Wouldn't that be great to have me and Candace talk at some point? That'd be awesome. That would be awesome. Now, John sent he sent two. One is that today is the 103rd birthday of Lyndon LaRouche. And that is very, very important. I mean, Lyndon LaRouche is kind of a pivotal figure who I don't completely, there are things about him I don't agree with, especially what his organization was like in the 80s and 90s. I think that the group has actually pivoted in a very good direction recently. They barely say anything I disagree with nowadays. I mean, now they are just out there promoting the Belt and Road. They do great work. Jose Vega is absolutely awesome, but and that I read their material from the 70s. They had a very good critique of the Marxist left, and they were fighting to preserve the anti-Malthusianism. Karl Marx was anti-Malthusian. The big foundations funded by the Rockefeller think tanks and all of that are pro-Malthusian. They think that, there's too many people in the world. And in the 70s, the left got taken over by the degrowthers, by the people who think that growth is bad. Well, that's not what Marx said. Marx did not say economic growth is a bad thing. Poverty is beautiful. That's not anywhere in Marx. The whole point of socialism is to have a rationally organized economy, so there is no limit to growth. And Lyndon LaRouche was a Marxist, but he wasn't part of the club, the club of people who run Marxism, who get to decide who's, important in Marxism. And he insisted on that point, that there is no limit to growth. And he taught classes at the free school, what they called the Free University of New York, which was a place you could go and take classes about Marxism. He taught against Malthusianism, and he built a layer of people that were Marxist activists. They were Trotskyists, actually. They were opposed to Malthusianism and degrowth, and they called him a Nazi, and they started a campaign against them. And he opposed, one of his big disagreements was that the Ford Foundation was pushing, black separatism. It was pushing, in the name of black nationalism, it wanted to separate the schools of Harlem from the rest of New York City. And it looked like black nationalism. It was really about degrowth. It was community control. It was to break the teachers' unions. And so all the leftists supported the black community and this demand for black, segregated schools in Harlem for the black community only. The teachers' unions opposed it because it would hurt their unions. And LaRouche opposed it because he saw that the Ford Foundation was funding it, and they were doing it in order to hurt teachers' unions and impose degrowth. So he ended up, his followers supported the teachers' union, and his, the rest of the communist groups opposed the teachers' unions. There was fist fights and all of that. And then eventually there were all kinds of things. But, it's an interesting study. I've studied the National Caucus of Labor Committees a lot. The main reason I've studied LaRouche is because LaRouche is somebody who legitimately believed in Marxism, knew a lot about Marxism, taught classes on Marxism, etc. And then he just wouldn't go along with the Marxist left turning against what Marx was supposed to say, and they went after him. And the same thing happened to me. I never thought in a million years I would be hanging out with the LaRouche people, and we're not totally cool now. There's been some tension and whatever, but I do quote Lyndon LaRouche occasionally and stuff. I never in a million years thought that, especially when I saw them in the 90s and in the 2000s. I thought they were crazy people, but they've shifted a lot. But as soon as I formed Students and Youth for a New America back in 2015, immediately it was the same thing they did to LaRouche. Nazi, and it's because these communist groups are controlled. They're controlled by intelligence. And when an entity comes along that is not controlled by intelligence, it immediately gets targeted by the people that run it. And they're like business owners. They're trying to preserve their monopoly. But their monopoly is maintained by U.S. intelligence, right? It's maintained by the deep state. They may not know that, right? I mean, the people running the Communist Party and the Workers' World Party and Freedom Road, they may not know that the CIA is helping them maintain their monopoly, but it is, right? It is the CIA that's helping them maintain their monopoly. And when somebody emerges and just forms, a group that is anti-imperialist, that is not part of their, is not an asset, it has to be squashed, right? And so I got targeted in the same way LaRouche did. And the LaRouche people were saying things I agreed with about China and Russia and stuff. So I got friendlier to them, and I read a lot of their old stuff from the 70s. And I learned a lot from it. And, I never joined. I was never a member of the LaRouche group. And now we're not friendly, unfortunately. But, I think some of them came to our rally in Chicago. That was a great development. And we would happily work with them to support peace with Russia and other things. And there are a lot of their concepts that I do, learn from. And I mean, especially their emphasis on the fact that Malthusianism is not Marxism. That's a big point. Marx spent years arguing against Malthusianism, and now degrowth and Malthusianism is synonymous with Marxism. So in honor of LaRouche's 103rd birthday, this is his when he ran for president in 1980, he launched his campaign with this crazy speech, not all of which I would agree with, but it's very entertaining. It's probably the most entertaining LaRouche speech I've ever seen. I've actually put it on my other YouTube channel, Caleb Bompin Videos. I'm going to put on some of that speech for you all. Certainly entertaining. Let me put it that way.
Athens were corrupt, and don't talk to me about mass movements, relevant political forces. Don't give me any of the pragmatic things. They don't work. They've all failed. In fact, they have greased the skids that have led us into this situation. So let us look back to the 4th century BC. Let us look back to the case of Alexander the Great, because that's the key to what I must try to do now. That is the key to the only thing that's going to prevent this sick human race, this civilization which has declared itself morally unfit to survive. It's the only means by which this civilization will survive. It's the only means by which having children is going to mean a thing. What happened in the 4th century BC? Well, the world was in a horrible mess. You had the ugliest of obscenities up to that time. The Persian Empire, dominating the world. The allies of the Babylonian cults, which ran the Persian Empire, were running Egypt, the cult of Isis, the cult of Thebes. Greece was in a hideous state. The city-states of Ionia had been crushed. The majority of the forces in Athens were corrupt and rotten. The evil cult of Apollo, of Delphi, ran much of Greece and was already running Rome at that time, which was a little obscure hick town at that point in the Mediterranean. The preponderance of forces in the world was evil, as today. And there was a great scheme afoot, very much like the one world scheme of Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells and Aldous Huxley and Robert M. Hutchins and all these other UNO-type kooks. These one world, UNO, it's our enemy. First thing you ought to do is shoot that down if you want to defend the United States. Then you can take care of the lesser enemies afterward. They were going to divide the world. They had a new scheme. This old one Persian Empire thing wasn't working out too well. You had to make 2 Persian empires. So they had this grand scheme for doing this. And Philip of Macedon, aided by the agent, this cult agent, Aristotle, as well as others, had the scheme for conquering Greece, putting it under Macedonia, and then using that conquest, using the Greek forces, which are the only qualified fighting troops in the world at that time, and using that thing to carve up the world between an Eastern Persian Empire and a Western Persian Empire, or a Western Empire based on what was called the oligarchical Persian model. The same philosophy. The Great Britain or the United Nations organization, or the people behind the Carter administration, or the kooks down in the crypt of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York. The same kind of kookery. Cults, oligarchical models. We mustn't have too much technology. Science is a threat. Back to the simple life. Small is beautiful. Let's have a bigger empire. The same kind of kookery. It was in this setting that the work of Plato and the conspiratorial organization known as the Academy at Athens developed. And at the point that Philip of Macedon, or Philip the Unspeakable, as we speak of him privately, was about, with his homosexual generals, to take them out of the ways of pederasty for a moment, and to lead the forces already based in Asia Minor down to accomplish this great project, the creation of 2 Persian empires that is a one-world arrangement of 2 empires, 2 regionalizations. At that point, Philip was assassinated. And in the ensuing affray, Alexander the Great, a protege of the Academy of Athens, advised by them, took over, consolidated his position, and led these pederastic generals who never improved their morality. They were never positive forces for humanity, and led them to destroy the Persian Empire. And during the brief period of his remaining life, to set into motion the greatest city-building project, the greatest project of human development mankind has ever seen, in terms of the population and the rate of development involved. Building cities everywhere. There were Alexander cities all over the world, and more planned. Great trade development, great cultural development. Then Aristotelizations poisoned Alexander. And the pederastic sodomy-performing generals took over again and destroyed most of the world. And that great, hideous obscenity called the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire took over and plunged humanity in the course of existence into a dark age, a genocidal dark age of famine, relieved by cannibalism, epidemic, and homicidal social chaos. And out of this process, the Neoplatonics managed to save civilization, which, such as it is, we have today. We're about to lose. Now, we must look at the world today, not in terms of which good countries as objective entities have the right presidents and ruling parties, and do they represent the majority, and can they run the world, and are we safe? It ain't going to work that way. It cannot. The people are ignorant.
Yeah. No, I'll skip ahead. I'm doing this for his birthday. I know we can't. You can watch the whole speech on my other YouTube channel if you want, but I just find this speech to be very entertaining.
We will not ask the opinion of third world countries. We don't have to. Because a government of a third world country that doesn't want that is no good. Therefore, we ignore it. The government that does is a good government. Therefore, we honor its opinion. Because a government will not develop high technology agriculture, develop industry and high technology infrastructure and education for its people. A government that sits back and says, we don't want any of that imperialist culture or European culture. That's depressing. We say, okay, you're stupid, fellow. Get out of the way. We're going to do it anyway. It's not going to be democratic. Not in that term. Because our problem is, the world is morally unfit, the present state of civilization, to survive. And we have to break civilization out of its present state to a higher state. We must move people by having people who can lead in crucial positions of leadership, and move the unworthy and unfit that have to be moved to do good work the way Alexander moved his generals. Now that brings me to the point about the International Caucus of Labor Committees. Although we did not set out to do so consciously back in 1966, for very lawful reasons, particularly then we found ourselves becoming. But because we are at a point, we've got two problems in the world. First of all, drugs and a miserly and dastardly and treasonous destruction of the process of education is turning out increasingly from our secondary schools students who aren't qualified mentally to graduate from the third grade. The minds, the productivity, the potential of our society is being ruined. And we say, and all of us agree more or less on that, children have the potentiality to be a genius. And once the child's mind grasps that freedom and creativity and law are not antagonistic, except if you misunderstand law, once the child has understood that, then the foundation is laid, the foundation of reference.
Anyhow, it's a good speech. So happy birthday. Thanks for that, John. I find that speech to be very entertaining. Go and watch the whole thing for yourself. I was just skipping around there through some of the highlights. Didn't find my favorite part of it yet, but there you go. John asks, is there another day of action coming up? Yes, we are shortly to publish our call for the October 4th National Day of Action to support the peace talks, to call for the prosecution of John Bolton. It's going to be an important day of action for the Center for Political Innovation. We're going to publish our call for that shortly. And we voted to do that at our Saturday meeting. So it's very important that we be in the streets October 4th. Yeah, we're going to do it. We're going to be out there and just like we were before, continue the peace talks, end Ukraine war, stand with Tulsi Gabbard and her effort to fight against the deep state. And yeah, some crazy stuff is going on in the world. Now, we do have some Rumble rants to answer before we end tonight's stream. Penny Arco says, from desert to dinner in the Uyghur Autonomous Region. And this is a news report from China about their development work. Okay, well, we'll put that on, right? Again, building. That is the revolution, folks. It's about building and constructing. It's not about, there is a death economy of Malthusianism and imperialism in the West, and there's building and construction going on in the BRICS world, right? We need to join the new world that is rising. And imperialism is all about degrowth and destruction and hating humanity. And the future is growth and investing in people, So we'll put this report on that Penny sent. Very, very important. Just waiting for it to come on here. We'll do that. Just downloading that report. Leo Messi says, a lot more Americans are talking about how crime is up in the U.S. and how Russia and China and Gulf states and Singapore are safer and higher trust societies. Why is it the U.S. is just so dangerous? Well, I think that, well, I'll answer that after we show Penny's report. I don't know if we'll show the whole thing because, but we'll try to put this on here from Desert. Okay, here we go. Thank you for sending it, Penny.
Of Xinjiang, it's usually majestic landscapes, vast desert, or probably delicious lamb skewers. But what you might not know is that it's also home to a massive and booming salmon industry. Deep in China's inland Xinjiang region lies the point farthest from any ocean on Earth. Every 3 years, each one of these high-tech facilities produces 100 tons of salmon. So, how has this landlocked territory become a major source for a fish we often associate with the sea? With that question in mind, I traveled to a salmon trout farm in Xinjiang's Neoconservatives County. There, a local fisherman named Ayhan Bakhtalati offered to give us a boat tour of the aquatic farms. He told me that the water temperature here, which ranges from 8 to 12 degrees Celsius, creates the ideal condition for salmon to thrive.
The water in Nilka County comes from melted snow from over 100 river valleys of the Tian Shan Mountains. That's why our fish are high quality in texture and appearance. Our salmon farming is fully automated. With a single button, we control feeding schedules and amounts down to the minute. We have 3 water quality monitoring platforms and underwater cleaning robots. If any issues are detected, we conduct on-site inspections immediately.
Ayhan explained that the equipment keeps the water healthy by removing fish waste and leftover feed, safeguarding both the salmon and the ecosystem. He also told me that as a former herder, he's glad to have learned a new skill while earning a higher income.
We have a diverse team from various ethnic backgrounds, including Kazakh, Mongolian, Kyrgyz, and Uyghur. Over 800 people now work in our company. The salmon industry has not only created more jobs here, but also provided a new source of income for local families.
The flourishing salmon industry in Xinjiang isn't just powered by local fishermen like Ayhan, but also by outside professionals, thanks to a government talent attraction program.
Since we began operation, we have received strong support from all levels of government, helping us bring in experts from the fishery sector. We have also benefited from tax reductions and subsidies when purchasing equipment.
As of early September, the government investment in the industry has exceeded 110 million yuan, or about $15.1 million. In the first half of 2025, Xinjiang salmon output exceeded 5,000 tons, marking a 30% increase year on year.
These are value-added products of the salmon we produced.
To cater to rising standards and growing demand for product diversity among Chinese consumers, Xinjiang salmon industry has expanded beyond fresh production. It has developed a range of value-added goods, including fish cakes, smoked salmon, fish bone powder, salmon oil, and more, effectively enhancing the overall value of its offerings.
The salmon industry is still relatively new in Xinjiang. No matter how fast we develop, we must make sure to protect the natural resource and ecosystem.
Looking ahead, Neoconservatives County's commitment extends beyond production to green development and sustainable tourism.
Neoconservatives County has 113 river valleys. Each one has a unique landscape. I'd like to welcome all visitors to come and experience the beautiful scenery for themselves.
Ensuring economic growth, works hand in hand with environmental protection. 陈兰佑 CGTN 新疆 Uyghur Autonomous Region.
All right. Well, that was an example of what happens when the government invests in people and invests in the community and foments growth by rationally organizing the means of production. There you go, right? A pro-growth, pro-humanity, anti-monopoly government, the opposite of what the imperialists want. So Leo Messi says a lot more Americans are talking about how crime is up in the U.S., how Russia, China, and the Gulf states and Singapore are safer and higher trust societies. Why is it that the U.S. is just so dangerous? Well, crime in the USA, it's actually kind of interesting because it's bad now. It was much worse in the 70s and 80s. It's kind of interesting. Crime was much more common in the 70s and 80s. And then in the 90s, it significantly decreased, mainly because they just had genocidal policies of just, imprisoning people for ridiculous amounts of time. And they just, they made it impossible for poor people to exist. Right. And I guess in theory that made us safer, but it also, destroyed all kinds of lives of all kinds of people. In the 90s with mass incarceration in New York City, you had Mayor Giuliani, and it was illegal for homeless people to sleep on park benches. They would be arrested and thrown in jail for doing it. They homeless proofed the city. So it was put spikes everywhere. And, it was like that in the 90s, there was kind of a war on low income people that was devastating, but it resulted in less crime in everyday life. And now the U.S. economy is falling apart once again. There was kind of an economic expansion in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union. And there's a big fight within our state apparatus right now. The heroin stuff has penetrated, a lot of the communities. I think about when you think about crime, I think about, a neighbor, growing up, I remember sitting in a Sunday school class. And somebody, some teacher saying, is there anyone here who knows anyone who's been in jail, known anyone who's been in prison? And there, the Sunday school class, there was like, no one's, people said no. And it's funny because there are people that were in that room with me. There was maybe 12 of us sitting there and we all didn't know anyone who'd been to jail. There are people in that room that were there with me that are now in jail, that are now in prison. And I think about that, right? It's funny because we were sitting there, none of us knew anybody who'd been in jail. And then I think 2 of the people that were in that room with me are now in prison. And the opioid epidemic and the deindustrialization and, a lot of the areas of the United States that were crime free, if you want to call them that, are much more crime ridden. One thing is the Black community was always targeted, right? White people use drugs at roughly the same rate as Black people, right? Now, that's one thing that, but Black people, the police arrested them for it and they were thrown in prison for it. Whereas white people, they didn't face the same kind of penalties, to the point that the laws were written that way. Laws were written in a certain way. The Million Man March played a certain role in reducing crime. That's a good point too, right? That was a very, very important thing that happened. So it's a complicated situation, but right now U.S. society is falling apart in multiple ways. Okay. And there's an internal crisis. The state is fighting with itself. We got the opioid thing going on. We got the federal government and the local policing agencies at odds with each other. We're in a mess right now in the United States. And as a result of that, there has been an uptick in criminal activity. And Trump is certainly, playing that up and emphasizing his use of the military. So there's many layers to it. Another thing, though, is that the economy of most cities, and this is important, has really deteriorated because of the pandemic. Right? New York City was much more prosperous until we had a year where you couldn't go to a Broadway play, you couldn't go outside. And so ever since the pandemic, there's been so many boarded up stores and all of that. And the things that made, urban centers thriving and places people wanted to go have gone away. And instead, now there's a lot of, homeless people there and a lot of people that are struggling. And, it's, the U.S. economy, there's been these degrowth policies like the lockdowns, and people have been devastated and people are suffering. And there is, downward social mobility. And when you have downward social mobility, you're going to have more crime. And there's been a lot of downward social mobility, and there's also a lot of society-wide confusion. And I mean, that's the situation we're in, but it's not as bad as it was, though. I mean, I hear about the 70s and 80s. My mom came to visit me one time in New York City, and we were walking down. At that point, I worked at the United Nations. Was walking down, showing her where I lived, and she said, "Oh my God, is this 42nd Street? Oh, I don't know if I can go on 42nd Street." I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, when we came to, when I came to New York City when I was in college, someone got robbed on 42nd Street." Well, somebody getting robbed on 42nd Street in New York City is very rare nowadays, but apparently back in the 1970s, and it was quite common in the early 70s, in the late 70s, and the 80s for one to get robbed on 42nd Street in Midtown Manhattan. Now, people do get robbed in Manhattan. It does happen, and there is crime in Manhattan. But the idea that someone could be mugged on 42nd Street during the day, that just doesn't happen, right? But there was a time where it did happen, right? It did happen. Right? Pickpockets are becoming more common in New York City, where people, pull your wallet out of or they snap, that's a little bit different. Mugging, though, used to be a lot common. It used to be, someone would pull a knife or a gun out and say, "Give me, what you got, or I'm going to stab you, or I'm going to shoot you." That doesn't happen in New York City very much anymore. I mean, it does to some degree. And I was robbed when I first moved to this city. I was, I've told that story before. I won't tell it tonight. But when I first moved to the city, the first year I lived in this city, I was robbed when I was living in Queens. I was there, I was the victim of crime, and I was the victim of crime in Cleveland too. Someone robbed me when I was in Cleveland. These things do happen. So, I mean, it's not that it doesn't happen now. It does happen. It's not as bad as it once was. I mean, apparently in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was a really big problem with crime in America. In the 90s, it decreased, and now it's starting to come back. And I guess what's different is that there were areas in America where it was much less common, where it's actually very common. In fact, I would say there's a lot more crime in the Rust Belt now. In Ohio, where I grew up, in the town I grew up in, there was like no crime there when I was a kid. And now there's crime all the time. And a lot of people I went to school with are in jail. And, my town, the area that I grew up in, it's crime ridden now. Indiana is crime ridden, right? Illinois, rural parts of Illinois and Iowa are crime ridden now. They didn't used to be that way. It used to be crime was kind of an inner city problem. Now crime is starting to return to the inner cities, but it's in a lot of the rural areas, the Rust Belt, they're much more crime ridden than they used to be. Heroin gangs and stuff like that, human trafficking, stuff like that didn't used to happen in rural areas. Suburbs, rural areas used to not have these issues. Now they have them. So I don't know. I will say one thing is part of the crime thing. I mean, we do still have less crime than we used to. Part of it is just cultural. Right, is that, and I'm not sure this is good, right? And this is where I start to sound like a libertarian, right? It used to be that fighting in school was the most normal thing. It was just part of being a male. Girls didn't fight. They rarely physically fought, but it was part of being a male was that you fought in school. When I was a kid, got into a fight, whatever, got kicked out of school for a week, no big deal, right? And I heard that, 10 years before that was like in the late 90s, right? 10 years before that, if you were a kid and you got in a fight, nothing happened, right? And things like bullying and all of that were kind of tolerated, which is not good. But, there was kind of a feeling that, the boys will be boys, kids will solve this among themselves, right? Well, when I was a kid, they were starting to crack down on it. The Columbine thing happened and all that. Nowadays, if two kids get into a fight, the police are going to get involved. And kids can't protect themselves. If a kid's being targeted by a bully, all he can do is throw his hands up and say, "Teacher, help me." And if he so much as, throws one punch in defense, he gets kicked out of school also. And they kind of cultivated a sense of powerlessness, and that violence in everyday life used to be much more common. People tell me that, in the 60s and 70s and 80s even, you had an anti-war protest. It was very common that somebody walking by would just come and get into a fist fight with you. And that was just normal. And it wouldn't be like a mobilization of conservatives who came. It would just be somebody walking by who didn't agree with those protesters, and they'd run and you would have a scuffle, with people who disagreed with you, and that was normal. In New York City, which is a very liberal place, if you had an anti-war rally, it was normal that a couple construction workers would come over and try to have a fight with you, and you would fight with them, and there'd be a couple bloody noses. And that was just normal, and people just dealt with it. And that was why it was kind of heroic to be a protester, but it was just, you learned to fight back and whatever, right? And that part of why the Workers' World Party, Youth Against War and Fascism, part of their reputation was that they were not hippies. They would fight back, and they taught their people how to punch back and how to, use the picket line, the picket sign as like a weapon. Back now, you can't have a wooden picket sign, but back in the day you could. And, all kinds of things you can't do anymore, and it was just violence, because you disagree with somebody on the street was normal. Violence in the workplace used to be much more common. And it's just, as a society, we've kind of pivoted to this. We want policing in everyday life, right? And if you go to the developing world, it's not like that, right? In the developing world, again, people fight with each other, violence takes place, but we've kind of pivoted to a society where we do very much police everyday interactions, right? If you have a job, you punch a coworker, you're done, right? I mean, you're fired, right? Unless you're a teacher, right? If a teacher flips out and hits a kid, they get like 5 days suspended from school and they get their job back. The teachers unions are very good, but I mean, I guess it used to be legal for teachers to hit kids completely, but nowadays, right? Unless you're a teacher, and if you are at work and you hit somebody, forget it, right? Forget it. You're done, right? It didn't used to be like that. And it's not like that in a lot of the developing world. In a lot of the developing world, it's, people fight with each other. So I don't know. Our society is very, very different. No, I remember, anyway, I could ramble about this. I could ramble about this for days. I mean, I had I guess I had a drama teacher in high school who was a very unpleasant person. She was just very, very unpleasant and a very unhappy person. Whatever. And she was just very verbally abusive. And, and we all took it, right? My generation, we took it because we were, again, we grew up with, we grew up with more of a traditional culture. Let me just put it that way, right? We grew up, and it was a small town, religious community. So my generation, she would start going off and verbally abusing kids and calling them stupid and yelling. And we would just, whatever, we would take it. But a couple years after I graduated from high school, the generation of kids that are coming up, it's less traditional, right? They're raised in a little less authoritarian methods. And she was doing her usual thing and screaming and yelling at the kids and calling them stupid or whatever. And this one kid, he just, a freshman in high school, just yelled back at her, I guess. Right. And just, gave her some of her own medicine and was yelling back at her. So she just was in shock. She didn't know what to do. So she whacked the kid in the head. She just whacked him in the head and she didn't get fired. And I found out that in Ohio, you can't get fired for physical assault, that you can, and so she got suspended from teaching for 5 days, and she had to go take an anger management class. But teachers, right? I guess if you're a teacher and you flip out and hit somebody, you can do that. And then apparently, there was another incident, where a teacher punched another teacher at the high school that I went to that my brother told me about. And I didn't even know about this, but there was a situation. I don't even want to get into the details. Like one teacher thought another teacher something. It's about sex. It's always about sex, but something about sex. There was some sexual drama going on. Somebody was mad at somebody else. And so a teacher punched another teacher. And again, 5 days suspended from school. And then he came back. I don't know. No other job can you do that. I don't know any other job where you can punch a coworker or someone you're supposed to be taking care of and not lose your job. But, being a teacher, I guess one can, assault people and get away with it. So there you go. Yeah, but I don't know. It's a strange world we live in. Right. And Earl, this is different than the issue of corporal punishment, right? And corporal punishment is still legal in a number of U.S. states, and I talked about that before. But corporal punishment in the places where it's still legal, it's very much regulated. It's not like the old Catholic school days with the teacher chasing the kids around with a ruler or whatever. It's not like that at all. It's, it's very much a regulated procedure. It's very much a regulated procedure, that is highly regulated, with parents signing forms ahead of time. And that's a whole different can of worms you can ask somebody else about. I probably shouldn't talk about those kind of things. That's a different thing, right? And that's also very interesting because, there was a time back in the day where teachers could just punch kids in the face and nothing happened and stuff like that. And it's not like that anymore. But teachers, they can hit kids or other teachers and not get fired, right? I don't know how that works, right? You'd think teachers would be held to a higher standard, but most jobs that you have, if you assault a coworker, you're fired automatically, no questions asked. Period. I don't know, it's pretty weird. But it used to be that wasn't the case, and that, fist fights between coworkers were something that happened, right? And people were okay with that. It was just a reality of life, right? And maybe it was dealt with, but I mean, our culture has really, really changed in a lot of ways. And so part of the reason I think crime was more common in the 60s and 70s was culturally, there was more of a tolerance for it. Bar fights, for example, right? Bar fights, right? That used to be something that was very common. There'd be a couple people at the bar and they'd fight with each other at the bar, and there'd be a bouncer at the bar that would kick them out of the bar. And that was it, right? Well, now, if you're at a bar and you're drinking and somebody else is at the bar and drinking and you punch them, the police are going to show up, right? You better get out of there quick because the police are going to show up. That's assault, right? It used to be bar fights. Well, that's what people do when they're drunk. They fight, right? And that's why you have a big, strong guy in the bar who's called the bouncer, the security guard. And, and if two people start to fight, he picks you up and throws you out of the bar, right? That used to be how it is. Now, if somebody assaults somebody else in a bar, you're looking at assault charges. You're looking at the police coming and taking you away in handcuffs. So it's just, part of it is just culturally things have changed, right? And so crime, right? Crime is more common in an atmosphere where violence is more tolerated. And I think that's why, even though crime is starting to rise, it's not like it was, because we don't have the same kind of tolerance for violence in our culture that we once had. Is that a fair way of putting it? I don't know. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, all right. Next question. Did you see the protests in Indonesia? Yeah, I saw that. And it's like the Nepal situation. I agree with my buddy Noah that the Nepal thing looks like a color revolution, but I'm not sure. Things can develop in different ways. You got to be careful with these things. You don't want to call it too soon, right? You never know. It could start out one way and spin another way. That happened in Iran a couple of years ago. There was a protest movement in Iran that actually started out in a good thing. It was a call for stricter banking regulations and returning to the anti-capitalist principles of the Islamic Republic, right? They've liberalized a lot of their economy in Iran. And there was a local region where a private bank that functions within their Islamic system, ripped some people off. And so the people that were very religious and in line with Khomeini, they rioted and they rose up against the bank. And that started out as a good thing. But then all of the anti-Iran groups funded by the US government, the Shah supporters and the Mujahideen Khalq, they went out and launched an actual uprising against the system. So the uprising was crushed, and then the Iranian government mobilized big demonstrations against capitalism. It was a wild situation, and that was a situation where it started out as kind of a genuine rebellion among the people wanting to get back to the anti-capitalist principles of the revolution, but then negative forces hijacked it, right? And Yemen is a situation where that started out, that was a color revolution, but the Houthis were able to intervene in it, and it turned into Yemen now being what it is today. You can actually read about that in my book, Who Are the Houthis? The Houthis are in power because there was a color revolution in Yemen during the Arab Spring, and they intervened effectively, and they turned it into a situation that they were able to come to power out of. So you never know with these things. Sometimes unrest can go different ways, But generally, generally, if there's a rebellion someplace and CNN and the New York Times is cheering for it, it's probably bad. That doesn't mean, though, that somebody good can't maneuver within it and get something good. So you want to wait. You want to wait before you call it. You know what I mean? And that's a good thing, is to just wait, sometimes. Like the situation in Nepal, it looks not good to me, but I don't know, right? I mean, who knows what could happen? Indonesia, I don't even know enough about it, but, I'm looking at it, and, sometimes, things can go in different ways. So, I see some stuff, and I'm just waiting, and that you don't want to jump the gun, right? Because, you don't want to jump the gun. You just don't want to jump the gun necessarily, right? I really hoped, for example, when the new president of Nigeria came in, I really hoped that he would be, Buhari when he was elected. Goodluck Jonathan was the corrupt leader of Nigeria for so many years. I was so excited when Buhari came to power. I thought he would be a Bonapartist and all this. He was awful. Buhari was awful. Nigeria has not moved in a good direction at all. I was really hoping Buhari would be a Bonapartist, but he was not, and if anything, he was, a stricter enforcer of imperialism, and he targeted the Islamic movement of Nigeria, and he continued the austerity. He was awful. Buhari was an awful leader. And I just assumed, because he was a Muslim and not a Christian, because the atmosphere was one of, anti-imperialism, I thought that Buhari coming in, and the USA talked about how he had been a dictator in the 80s, which he had been. I thought, oh, they're already calling him a dictator, that he's going to move things good. And he didn't, right? Didn't happen. And sometimes that's the way these things go, right? So, obviously Ibrahim Traore, he's moving things in a good direction. That's a revolution happening in Burkina Faso. That's a revolution, and I mean, take Angola, for example. Angola, there was an uprising against austerity, and it looks like the way the government in Angola has calmed it down is they've turned it into an anti-China thing. The government of Angola said, you know what? Yeah, people are suffering. It's all China's fault. It's despicable. I mean, the sellouts that are running the MPLA, they need Isabel dos Santos back, but they were able to kind of hijack the anger and direct it in an anti-China direction, which is awful. They need Isabel dos Santos back in power. I'm a big fan of Isabel dos Santos. All right. So, next question. A black conservative was on Jason Whitlock. I don't know who Jason Whitlock is. He criticized MLK on the grounds he was a Hindu communist. Okay. And all white liberals decry Washington and Lincoln and need to defend U.S. history. A Hindu communist? I mean, I've heard the Martin Luther King being a communist thing. That's a common far-right trope, right? Because the civil rights movement was supported by communists. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a communist, right? Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister. And Martin Luther King Jr., denounced Marxism. And towards the end of his life, he became an advocate of what he called democratic socialism. But he renounced Marxism. He argued that Marx had distorted Hegel. And he was opposed to Marxism. And he was a Christian. And he framed everything he did in terms of Christian theology. I don't know. Hindu communism is not a thing, just FYI. Right? There is no such, I mean, maybe in India you can find somebody who calls themselves that. But generally speaking, Hindu nationalism is associated with the far right, generally. And there is a weird admiration for Hinduism among like the far right traditionally, right? Like Savitri Devi, right, was this Greek woman who converted to Hinduism and became a big supporter of the Nazis, wrote a whole book called Lightning and the Sun, all about Adolf Hitler and how she thought Adolf Hitler was the god Vishnu and all kinds of stuff. And so Nazis and far rightists in the West have a thing for Hinduism. But I mean, generally in India, traditional Hindu people and communists are on the opposite end of the spectrum. And how in the world would you think that Martin Luther King Jr. was that? I mean, Hinduism is a polytheistic religion. So how would Martin Luther King Jr. be a Hindu and a communist? So he's a Hindu communist? That's cuckoo. That's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. I don't know what that is. I mean, the guy doesn't like Gandhi, I guess. Maybe he thinks Gandhi. And was Gandhi Hindu? I don't know if Gandhi was Hindu. Was Gandhi Hindu? Right? So, I mean, it's like Martin Luther King Jr. was trained and admired Mahatma Gandhi. And is that what he gets it from? I mean, that's a really, wow. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. was a Christian pastor. He rejected Marxism, but liked democratic socialism towards the end of his life, not at the beginning. And he was a monotheistic. He believed in one God. He studied Gandhi. Calling Martin Luther King Jr. a Hindu communist, that really is a stretch. That is a big stretch. You have to remember, Gandhi was a very staunch anti-communist. The communists were opposed to Gandhi because Gandhi reached out to Hitler for support, right? And Gandhi was anti-communist. The communists of India hate Gandhi, right? They view Gandhi as potentially being a Nazi collaborator. Gandhi wrote a letter to Hitler and asked him to support the people of India against the British Empire and stuff. So, like, in India, right? Like, I don't know. It's like Martin Luther King Jr. was not a communist, and Martin Luther King Jr. was not a Hindu. And Hindu communist in Indian politics doesn't make sense. Gandhi, if it's about Gandhi was not a communist. Gandhi was a pacifist, and Gandhi was hated by the communists. And Gandhi, had kind of a soft spot for Hitler at some points in his life. Like, there's so much wrong with that statement. I don't know where to begin. I mean, that guy doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. You can find me that clip. I could make fun of this guy. I mean, maybe I won't. It's, I don't know. But yeah, that's really far off. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Hindu communist. That is Leo Messi. That is so far gone. I don't even know. Recently criticized Dr. King as a godless communist. Well, Hindus are religious. So if Martin Luther King Jr. is a godless communist, he can't be a Hindu then, can he? This is getting crazier by the minute, right? He's a godless communist who enabled fatherlessness. Well, how did he enable fatherlessness? I mean, first of all, Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister. When he said he supported socialism, he always said he denounced Marxism because Marxism was materialist and he rejected materialism. He always based his calls for socialism on the Bible, right? And he repudiated the Marxism. He always said Marxism was wrong. And Martin Luther King Jr. was an advocate of the traditional family, right? He got married, he had kids, he encouraged that kind of thing. He talked about we need jobs so fathers can provide for their kids. How did he enable fatherlessness? This is just silliness. And this is what annoys me, right? As much as I do think the woke people are kind of more of a danger and that Trump has the potential to do some good with, it's like conservatainment. People just get up there they say anything, right? It's like we just saw Candace Owens, right? About, they killed 60 million Christians and then set up Diamond Street in New York City. That didn't happen, right? Like, you can't just say that, right? The Zionists and the Bolsheviks and Stalin are not the same people, and it's just, they just say shit. And it's just like, it's kind of like when Obama, remember during the Tea Party, Obama was a Muslim, fascist, communist. It's like, no, you can't be all three of those things. Oh boy. Part of this is showing that ideology is pointless, but I don't know. Yeah, conservatainment, I think it thrives on a lack of intellectual curiosity. That is one aspect of when the neocons took over conservatism. There was this lack of intellectual curiosity. It was like, it's like that Okie from Muskogee song. We have our way of doing things, and we love our country, and we don't need your fancy learning, your fancy ideas. We just love our country. And if you don't like it here, move out, right? It's that kind of like, dumb conservatism, right? That kind of defined the Reagan era and the 90s and all of that. It was like knowing stuff and researching stuff is bad somehow. It makes you a weird nerd or something. So it's just like, what you are. You're Christian. You're in favor of capitalism. You're a conservative. You like Trump. And so it's like everything that's not you is the same. Hindus, well, they're not Christians, so they must be the same, right? And communists, right? Well, you can be a Hindu communist, right? You just throw it all together because they're all just not you. And it's funny because someone should tell this guy, Hindu nationalists tend to be supportive of Trump, right? More conservative people in India that are fans of Modi and the BJP tend to be Trump supporters. Tulsi Gabbard is very close to Modi and very much, she's a Hindu, right? She's from the Krishna movement, the Science of Identity Foundation. And Tulsi Gabbard is very Hindu in her orientation, and she's a Trump supporter. Hindus tend to hate Muslims, unfortunately. And part of Hindus hating Muslims is that, that's really the only place in the developing world you find strong support for Israel is among Hindu nationalists in India because they hate Muslims and Israel's fighting Muslims. Like that guy. So, if I mean, there's so much wrong with this. Like, so Martin Luther King Jr. is a Hindu communist. It's like, this guy's a Trump supporter. You do realize if Martin Luther King Jr. had been a Hindu, that would probably mean he was a Trump supporter. Like, there's so much wrong with this. You know, they don't know any of this, right? You know, I mean, it's just, again, it's lack of intellectual curiosity. That is one of the things. I think that's kind of what LaRouche was saying in that clip that I showed earlier. Lack of intellectual curiosity is one of the biggest problems we have in our world. Information is traveling more quickly than ever before, but yet people don't want to know. And that's a problem, right? People don't want to know. And yeah, it's like you got information right at your fingertips. There's all kinds of information that's available, but people don't want to know. That's a problem. That's a problem. All right, folks. All right. I think I've answered, Leo Messi sent the clip. All right. I'm not going to show it on here, but I might clip it. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Hindu communist. I mean, oh boy, I might have a fun time with that. Thank you for sending the clip. But yeah. All right. Listen, everybody, you know, my book on Trotsky is still at #1. It's still at #1. If you've already read it, go drop a review. That would be appreciated. It's top new release. It's been 2 weeks. It's still the top new release in radical political thought. Get a copy if you haven't got a copy. Join the Center for Political Innovation. We're always doing great stuff. I'll be back probably tomorrow night, if not tomorrow night, soon after. I'm always doing streams and talking about stuff. And join CPI. We got a day of action coming up on October 4th, and I will definitely be bringing the call to you on all of that. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. I'm putting on the closing music. Thanks. And yeah, it's always good. Always good. I'm going to cut the NCM book as an audio book that'll premiere this week and all that stuff. So talk to you soon. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.